Our story unfolds in a Norwegian fjord at first light, in the spring of 900 CE. A clinker-built longship lies ready at the head of a deep Norwegian fjord, its striped sail furled against the mast, its crew of 30 men preparing to row out on a long crossing of the northern seas. The voyage ahead will last many days, through waters they know only by the memory of those who have returned. The harbour at Korpang lies in grey half-light on the 14th morning of April in the year 892, and you are standing at the water's edge where the cold green fjord laps against frost-stiffened grass. Around you, men move in silence through the shallows, their breath rising in pale columns that dissolve into the pale diffusion of northern dawn light on still water. The ship before you is a longship of the largest sort, its clinker-built hull rising from the beach at a steep angle where the keel has settled into the gravel during the winter months. You feel the cold air move across your face, carrying the smell of pine tar and raw wool from the sailcloth that has been stored these past months in the boathouse nearby. The Viking Age is traditionally dated from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, and 892 falls squarely within that span of seafaring expansion that carried Scandinavian peoples across much of Europe and beyond. The vessel you are approaching is considerably longer than it is wide, a defining characteristic of the type, and its overlapping planks riveted together speak to the clinker technique that has dominated northern shipbuilding for generations. The planks are laid edge to edge in an overlapping pattern, secured with iron rivets that show as dark lines against the weathered oak where the pine tar has thinned with age. You can see the cold green water of the fjord through gaps between the clinker planks near the stern, where the ship has twisted slightly on its bed of beach stones. The men around you are named Ragnvald, Thorstein, and young Einar, who has never before left the fjord of his birth. Ragnvald is the steersman, a man of 40 winters whose hands have guided ships through the Shetland Passage and back again, and he moves now toward the starboard side, where the quarter-rudder waits in its mount. Einar follows close behind, his eyes fixed on the carved dragon head at the prow that faces outward toward the distant sea, its wooden snout glistening with fresh tar applied against the spring damp. Ships of this era were categorized by size and function into longships, nars, and smaller vessels, and this particular craft falls into the first category, built for war and swift passage rather than the heavy cargo that the broader-beamed nars would carry. A typical longship of this period might carry a crew of 25 to 80 men, depending on size, and a vessel measuring near to 20 meters from stem to stern could hold around 40 men for the crossing to the Shetlands, where crews often took on fresh water and provisions before continuing their voyage. The Gokstad ship, excavated in Norway, measured approximately 8 meters in length, and while this craft may not be as large as some famous finds, Viking ships typically shared a shallow draft that allowed them to navigate both open seas and rivers, and a flexibility of hull that helped them ride out North Atlantic swells that would founder heavier vessels. You wade into the water now, feeling the cold grip your legs through the woolen trousers that cling heavy and darkening as the fjord rises to your knees. The hollow knock of wooden oar-looms against the gunwale comes from somewhere ahead, where men are already stowing the long sweeps in readiness for the first pull. The slight give and flex of the ship's hull with each communal stroke is something you will come to know intimately in the days ahead. But now, the vessel sits rigid against the shore, unwilling to release its hold on the land. Your hands find the cold strake where the pine tar has been renewed, and you push with the others, feeling the gravel shift beneath the keel, feeling the ship begin at last to slide toward deeper water. The earliest archaeological Viking ship finds were burials with grave goods for high-status individuals, and the memory of such interments may have lingered in the minds of those who built and sailed similar vessels. Grave goods were intended to assist the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, and the thought of those equipped dead sailing their own vessels into darkness brings a solemnity to the morning that matches the grey light. Ship burials demonstrate the cultural centrality of seafaring to Viking society, and nowhere is this more evident than here, where living men pour their strength into a wooden hull that will carry them toward horizons their grandfathers never knew. The prow and stern of Viking ships were often elaborately carved, sometimes with dragon or animal heads, and the figurehead before you is among the finest you have seen, its eyes painted white with bone meal paste, its jaws parted as if to drink the wind itself. These carvings could be removed when approaching friendly shores to avoid frightening spirits, and you notice that Ragnvald has already loosened the pegs that hold the dragon head in place, ready to detach it when they reach the first settlement in the Western Islands. The sail remains furled as they row against the morning land breeze, a woolen mass of natural grey and brown stripes, where the weavers have worked different fleeces into the characteristic appearance that marks a vessel's origin. The cloth carries the tones of the western Norwegian uplands, where the sheep run wild on heather and birch scrub. Masts were typically removable and could be unstepped and laid along the deck when rowing, and you can see where the mast fish has been greased with animal fat, the wooden step polished smooth by seasons of use. Ragnvald takes his position at the starboard side quarter-rudder now, his feet finding their place on the deck without need of sight, his hands closing around the tiller that connects to the broad steering oar trailing in the water aft. The crossing from Norway to Iceland could take 7 to 14 days under favourable conditions, though this crew will not attempt so long a passage, instead making the shorter journey to the Shetlands, where Norse settlers had already established a presence. Voyages to Greenland, known from later sagas, required sailing first to the Shetlands or Faroes, and the knowledge of this longer road westward sits in Thorstein's memory like a song half-learned, waiting for the season when it will be called upon. The Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic expanded progressively westward from the late 8th century, and by the late 9th century, Iceland was being settled by Norse colonists, many likely departing from western Norway, a migration that these men in 892 might sense gathering like weather on the horizon. Oars are run out through the oar ports in rhythmic sequence now, the long ash shafts sliding through the holes in the upper strakes, the blades dipping into the cold green water that shows between the overlapping planks. You find your own oar, its loom worn smooth by generations of hands, and settle onto the sea chest that serves as your rowing bench. The hollow knock of wooden oar looms against the gunwale marks each placement, a soft percussion that will become the heartbeat of your days at sea. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from smaller vessels further up the beach, their voices carrying across the water with the particular flatness of sound in cold air. But your attention is on the men to port and starboard, on the need to match your pull to theirs. The first pull of the oars breaks the mirror-still surface of the fjord water, and you feel the slight give and flex of the ship's hull with each communal stroke as the vessel gathers way. The pale diffusion of northern dawn light on still water shatters into ripples that spread outward from each blade, disturbing the reflection of the cliffs that rise sheer from the eastern shore. The distant sound of a waterfall echoing from the fjord walls comes to you now, a continuous murmur that has been present all along, but only now, as the ship moves into deeper water, separates itself from the general silence of the morning. You pull again, and again, finding the rhythm that Ragnvald sets with a low, wordless hum that carries forward from the steering position. Seabirds rise from the cliffs in passing, wheeling overhead as the ship glides past their nesting ledges, their cries thin and piercing against the vast, damp air. They are guillemots mostly, with the heavier bodies of shags beating past lower down, all of them disturbed by this early passage where no ship has moved since the autumn gales set in. The cold air moves across your face with a freshness that carries the salt of the distant open sea, mingling with the smell of pine tar and raw wool from the sailcloth that waits furled along the yard. You look up as you pull, seeing the pale sky lightening toward a color that might, by noon, deserve the name of blue, and the dragon head at the prow lifts and falls with each slow swell, its painted eyes fixed on the passage ahead. Thorstein speaks now for the first time, his voice low and carrying only to the nearest benches, telling of a winter he spent in the Orkney Islands where the currents run strange and the seals follow ships for days as if seeking passage themselves. The Oseberg ship was built around 820 CE and buried in 834 CE, and its grave goods were likely intended to assist the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, demonstrating how seafaring held deep cultural significance in Viking society. His words come between strokes, measured to the rhythm of the oars, and you find yourself listening less to their sense than to their sound, to the pattern of breath and syllable that matches the hollow knock of wooden oar-looms against the gunwale. The fjord walls begin to open before you, the high shoulders of land falling back to reveal the wider waters of the coastal passage where the North Sea waits. The cold green water of the fjord deepens to a darker shade as the bottom falls away, and the slight give and flex of the ship's hull with each communal stroke becomes more pronounced, the vessel responding to the longer swell that enters from the open water ahead. Ragnvald hums louder now, a signal to hold the pace steady as they approach the first of the tidal races where the ebb meets the incoming ocean, and you feel the water change beneath your blade, feel the cold intensify where the deeper currents rise. You pull, and the ship moves, and the world moves with it, the carved dragon head at the prow facing outward toward the distant sea with a fixed intensity that seems almost to summon the waves toward it. Einar looks back once, his young face showing pale in the growing light, and you see his eyes find the strand where they have left the winter behind, the boathouse diminishing with each stroke to a dark mark against the paler hills. Perhaps he is thinking of the vessels that carry men not westward toward new land, but downward into the dark earth with all that they will need for the journey beyond, those equipped dead sailing their own ships into darkness. The clinker technique involved planks laid edge to edge in an overlapping pattern, secured with iron rivets, and this knowledge of construction, this understanding of how the living wood is persuaded to hold the shape of human intention, seems suddenly as much a mystery as any burial rite. The ship moves on. The oars rise and fall, and the cold green water shows through gaps between the clinker planks where the strakes work against each other in the longer swell. The smell of pine tar and raw wool from the sailcloth is your constant companion now, mixed with the stronger salt that speaks of the open sea ahead, of the crossing from Norway to Iceland that could take 7 to 14 days under favorable conditions, though your own passage will be shorter, though your own horizon is the Shetland group where Norse speech already sounds in the voes and inlets. By 900 CE, Iceland was being settled by Norse colonists departing from western Norway, and the Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic expanded progressively westward from the 8th century until the edges of the known world frayed into ice and legend. You are rowing in 892, and this westward pulse is already moving in the minds of men like Ragnvald, like Thorstein with his memories of the Oseberg ship built around 820 CE and buried in 834 CE, like young Einar who will live to see the Great Migration if he lives at all. The Viking Age is dated from 790 to 1070 CE in the German scholarly tradition, and you are within it of it, moving through its characteristic medium with the characteristic means, the longship that is considerably longer than it is wide, carrying you toward the characteristic end. The sail was made of wool, often woven in strips of different natural colors, creating a striped appearance, And when at last it is raised, when the land breeze dies and the offshore wind fills its curves, you will see this pattern against the clouds, the mark of your passage visible to any who watch from the heights. The ship burials demonstrate the cultural centrality of seafaring to Viking society, and this centrality is written in your body now, in the ache across your shoulders that will settle into a deeper rhythm as the days pass, in the blisters that form and break and harden against the oar's familiar abrasion. The cold air moves across your face with a persistence that is almost gentle now, the wind finding its steady strength as the land falls further behind, and the seabirds that rose from the cliffs in passing, wheeling overhead, have given way to the wider-winged travellers of the open sea, the fulmars and the rare gannet that mark the edge of the continental shelf. Ragnvald's humming stops, and in the silence that follows, you hear only the oars, the water, the slight give and flex of the ship's hull with each communal stroke. You pull, and the world moves. The carved dragon head at the prow faces outward toward the distant sea, and you are moving with it, the land falling away, the water opening before you in a path that leads westward toward the islands, toward the farther islands, toward the ice and the legend, and the slow expansion of Norse presence across the North Atlantic that will carry your kind to the edges of the world and beyond. The overlapping planks riveted together flex and hold, the clinker technique that has built these vessels for generations proving itself again with each wave, each stroke, each slight give and return that speaks of life in the wood, of the tree's enduring response to the axe that shaped it and the water that receives it. The cold air moves across your face, and you are aware of it as a touch, a presence, something that holds you in the world without demanding response. Seabirds pass again, closer now, their shadows crossing the deck with a swiftness that makes you look up from the water. They are kittiwakes, you think, or perhaps terns, their white bodies flashing against the grey-blue of the open sky. They wheel and settle, following the ship for a time before peeling away towards some unseen destination of their own. You do not think of the land behind, or the land ahead, or the years that will pass before this voyage is remembered, if it is remembered at all, in the sagas that will be spoken by fires in halls you cannot imagine. You pull, and the oar moves through its arc, and the water receives it, and the ship moves on. The cold green water shows through gaps between the clinker planks near your feet, and you watch it for a time, the play of light on the moving surface, the occasional glimpse of deeper color where the sun penetrates further than the surface disturbance allows. The hollow knock of wooden oar-looms against the gunwale continues, softer now, as if the men have found a gentler rhythm, a slower pace that matches the lengthening of the morning into day. Ragnvald speaks, a single word that carries forward, and the oars lift together, hold, dip together, finding a slower measure that lets the ship glide longer between strokes. The cold air moves across your face with a steadiness that is almost warm in comparison to the first shock of morning, and you feel the sun, higher now, finding its brief strength on your exposed hands, your neck, the strip of forehead below your woolen cap. You understand it without translation, your body having learned in these few hours what your mind could only describe. You pull, and the world is water. The cold air moves across your face, gentle now, almost a caress, and the seabirds that rose from the cliffs in passing, wheeling overhead, have given way to the wider silence of the open sea, the greater emptiness that holds the ship and its company in a suspension that will last until land appears again, until the next shore rises from the water to receive you. The oars lift, the oars fall. The water receives them, releases them, receives them again. The cold air moves, the water moves. The ship moves with them, carrying you, and you are moving, and the world is wide, and the day is long, and the oars rise and fall in a rhythm that will continue, that will carry you forward into the hours ahead, into the slow unfolding of the voyage that has only now begun to reveal its true length, its true patience, its true and necessary slowness. The cold air moves across your face. You pull. The oar moves through its arc. The water receives it. The ship moves on. The cold air moves. The water moves. The ship moves. You are moving with it, in it, of it, the boundaries between self and vessel and sea becoming softer, less defined, more permeable with each slow stroke, each gentle lift and fall of the oar in its accustomed arc. The hollow knock of wooden oar looms against the gunwale is fainter, or your hearing has softened, has turned inward, has become more receptive to the inner. The ship of wood and rope carries you westward through waters that have no name, you know, through latitudes measured only by the height of the sun and the length of the shadows it casts across the deck. You are standing near the mast step, where the single great timber rises through the hull to meet the yard and the sail beyond your sight. Around you, the afternoon light falls in long parallelograms through the gaps in the reefed canvas, illuminating the pine tar that has darkened the planks to a color between amber and black. The warm smell of pine tar rises from the caulking, not sharp but lingering, a sweetness that belongs to forests and to the hands that prepared this vessel before you ever stepped aboard. The particular squeak and give of clinker planks underfoot marks each shift of your weight as you move toward the stern, where a man is moving through the ship testing each thwart with his weight. He is the steersman, though now the steerboard is shipped and the sail carries them, carries you, carries the ship of wood and rope in its westward passage. You watch him place his foot on the first thwart, the board that serves both as seating and as structural cross-member, and press down with a slow transfer of weight that makes the hull speak. The particular squeak and give of clinker planks underfoot answers his testing, each overlap of plank upon plank flexing in its iron rivets. He moves to the next thwart, and the next, and the complex pattern of wood grain visible where pine tar has darkened the planks catches the light as he passes, each split log plank following its own grain for strength. The flex of the hull is visible in the changing gap between gunwale planks as the ship rides over a swell and slides down its far side. You see it where the afternoon sun strikes at an angle, a line of brightness that widens and narrows with the living motion of the vessel. Clinker construction began with the keel, to which stem and stern posts were joined, and that long central timber still governs every movement, still transmits the sea's energy through the overlapping planks that were shaped from split logs rather than sawn, following the grain for strength. You move with him now, your own feet finding the same boards, the same squeak and give. The thwarts served both as seating and as structural cross-members, and you feel that dual purpose in the slight bounce of each step, the hull's lightness surprising after the solidity of the planks themselves. Each plank overlapped the one below, creating a hull that was both light and flexible, and that lightness is in your legs now, in the way the deck responds to your presence as a living thing responds, not dead weight, but something almost like breathing. The warm smell of pine tar rises from the caulking as you crouch where two men are working at a small leak that has announced itself in a darkening of the plank, a slight glossiness where water seeps through. The rough texture of oakum fibers worked between the fingers is what you feel as one of them teases apart the tarred mass, preparing the plug. A small leak at a rivet is plugged with oakum and hammered tight, the sound of the mallet dull and intimate, absorbed by the wood that receives it. The cold iron of rivets against the palm when testing for looseness is what the other man feels as he works his way along the row, pressing each head, each rove, finding the one that has worked in the flexing of the hull. That cold iron becomes a rhythm, a language of touch that every crewman speaks without thinking. A ship of wood and rope, the ship that was the most valuable possession of a Viking crew, often named and personified, holds you in its particular smell of pine tar and worked fiber and the sea itself. The bailing was constant labor. Every crewman understood the ship's vulnerability to leaking, and this understanding is in their movements, in the unhurried permanence of their vigilance. You rise from where you crouched and move forward toward the mast step, where the mate inspects the joint. He has removed a section of decking to expose the timber, and his fingers probe the corners where the step meets the keel, where the single great mast rises through the hull to carry the sail that now draws them westward. The overlap was secured with iron rivets passing through both planks, and somewhere below your feet that pattern repeats, the iron drawing the oak together through centuries of practice, through the accumulated knowledge of builders who never wrote their methods down. The mate's stillness is its own answer, his hands withdrawing with the calm of one who has found what he expected to find. The caulking between planks used animal hair mixed with pine tar, and that same mixture is in the repair materials carried aboard. Spare rivets, oakum, pine tar, and wooden plugs. You see them now in their bag, the wooden plugs shaped to taper, the spare rivets with their domed heads catching the light that falls through the reefed sail. Shrouds and stays of twisted walrus hide or horsehair rope supported the mast, and a coil of walrus hide rope lies where it was used for some adjustment, waiting to be restored. A man works without speaking, his movements economical, the rope finding its place in the hull's geometry of curves and overlaps. The single square sail was controlled by sheets and braces of braided cordage, and you can follow the lines of that control from where you stand, the sheets running aft, the braces to the yard, the whole system visible, comprehensible, nothing hidden in the ship of wood and rope. The complex pattern of wood grain visible where pine tar has darkened the planks draws your eye as you move toward the stern once more, each plank's grain unique, each split following the tree's own logic of growth and season. Planks were shaped from split logs rather than sawn, following the grain for strength, and that strength is in the grain's sinuous passage along each board, in the way the builder read the wood and placed it according to its nature. The ribs were inserted after the planking was complete, a distinctive feature of clinker building, and you know this though you cannot see them, know that the hull's shell came first, that its shape was set before the internal structure was added, a method opposite to the one you might have assumed. The particular squeak and give of clinker planks underfoot accompanies you to the steerboard side, where the steersman stands with his hand on the shipped oar, his gaze on the western horizon, where the sun is descending through layers of air that bend its light toward red. The ship's name is spoken aloud by the steersman, a brief ritual of acknowledgement, and though you do not catch the word itself, you feel the vibration of it in the hull, in the way the men around you seem to settle more deeply into their tasks. That personification is in the naming, in the brief ritual that acknowledges the ship as something more than wood and rope and iron, as a presence with its own will, its own needs, its own acceptance or refusal of those who sail it. Anchor stones of local rock were used before iron anchors became common, and you have seen such a stone in the bow, a shapeless weight of grey granite with a hole worn through by the rope that once held it, a relic of earlier voyages, earlier technology, still carried for its weight if not its use. Even now, even in this calm passage, you see the rhythm of bailing, the dip and lift of the scoop, the water thrown in arcs that catch the declining light before they merge with the greater water beyond the hull. That iron is the ship's other skeleton, the one that works with the wood's flexibility rather than against it, that holds without constraining, that permits the twist and release that keeps the hull whole. Archaeological finds at Ladby in Denmark preserve the impression of a complete ship burial, and this knowledge comes to you not as interruption, but as resonance, as the deep past confirming the present you inhabit. The ship of wood and rope will in some future be buried with its steersman, will carry him not westward, but downward, into the earth that preserves only impressions, only the spaces where wood and rope and iron once existed. But that future is not now. Now the ship lives, flexes, leaks and is repaired, carries its crew and its cargo and you, its temporary witness, through waters that have no name, you know. That joining is above you now, the wood grown dark with age and tar, the grain following the curve that the builder required, the strength of the split log concentrated where it is most needed. You sense the ribs now as a secondary rhythm, the internal structure that braces the shell without dictating its shape, that allows the hull its flexibility, its willingness to twist with the motion of the sea rather than resist it. You trace that overlap with your eye, the shadowed line where one board ends and the next begins, the slight ridge that is the clinker's signature, its name, its identity. You turn to watch the man testing the thwarts again, his progress slower now, more deliberate, as if the evening required a different pace, a different attention. His testing is of that double function, of the seat that must hold a man in weather and the member that must hold the hull in shape. The ship of wood and rope, the ship that carries you westward, seems to breathe more slowly in this evening light, its flexing gentler, its leaks perhaps fewer as the planks swell in the day's sustained wetness, as the oakum softens and expands in its tarred bed. The mate inspects the mast step again, or still, his vigilance unending, his hands knowing the timber by touch in the declining light. The shrouds and stays of twisted walrus hide or horsehair rope are darker now against the sky, their tension visible in the slight vibration that transmits the sail's pull to the hull, that converts wind into motion, into westward passage. The man who restowed the walrus hide rope moves away, his task complete, his place in the ship's economy of labor momentarily empty. The sound of the scoop continues, though fainter now, as if the bailing too were slowing toward evening, toward the rhythms of rest that the night will bring. The repair materials are secured now, put away against tomorrow's need, tomorrow's inevitable discovery of what the sea has worked loose in the darkness. The sound of the scoop has stopped now, the last water thrown, the last arc completed, the tool finding its place among the thwarts that served both as seating and as structural cross-members. The repair materials wait in their bag, patient, prepared for the needs that tomorrow will certainly bring, the leaks that will certainly announce themselves in the first light, the rivets that will certainly have worked in the night's flexing. The morning light spreads across the water in thin sheets of silver, and you are standing amidships as the first true wind of the day reaches your face. Around you, the crew have been pulling at their oars since before dawn, their bodies bent in the steady rhythm that has carried the vessel through hours of flat calm. The oars of this longship, each one 3 to 4 meters in length, rise and fall in ordered sequence, their blades entering the water with a soft kiss and emerging with a heavier, dripping sound. You feel the timber beneath your feet shudder with each coordinated stroke, the whole hull responding to the collective will of 30 men working through ports in the ship's side, not over the gunwale as a landsman might expect. The air holds the salt thickness of proximity to open sea, and somewhere ahead, beyond the grey horizon that has barely begun to separate from the grey sky, lies the day's intended landfall. The man beside you breathes in ragged measure with his pulling, his shoulder brushing yours at the full extension of each stroke. His hands, like yours, have grown leathered against the loom of the oar, the wood polished dark by seasons of sweat and salt, and the particular oils that human skin leaves upon worked timber. You notice how the oar handles are shaped to a slight swell in the middle, how the hands find this swell without looking, how the body knows its business when the mind has long since ceased to attend to particulars. The chant that sets the pace has dropped to a murmur now, some half-remembered rhythmic call that needs no words to maintain its purpose, though specific melodies are not recorded and perhaps were never fixed, perhaps changed with each voyage and each captain, perhaps existed only in the moment of their making and dissolved thereafter into the general memory of how things were done when men rowed together toward a common purpose. The water slides past the hull with a sound like silk being drawn through still fingers, and the ship holds its course by the constant attention of the steersman aft, his quarter rudder requiring continuous adjustment against the small betrayals of current and the uneven pull of oars that are never perfectly matched, however precise the coordination. The light strengthens by imperceptible degrees, the sky becoming less a single tone and more a composition of layered greys, and the first pale suggestion of warmth somewhere behind the eastern cloud. You feel the cold air moving across your face in a pattern that has shifted, that comes now more directly from behind, that carries upon it the faint green smell of distant land rather than the empty salt of open water. The man at the forwardmost oar, whose name you have heard spoken as Thorvald through the night's labour, lifts his head and tests the air as a man tests wine, his nostrils flared and his eyes half closed in concentration. He speaks a word to the man next him, and that word passes down the line in the manner of such ships, each man repeating what he has heard until it reaches the steersman, until it reaches the captain where he sits amidships, wrapped in his sea-stained cloak. The word is wind, or enough, or now, or some combination of these that means the time has come to change the nature of the vessel's labour, to shift from oars to sail and accept the gift that the weather offers. The captain rises, and his voice carries without force across the deck, the habit of command in a world of wind and water needing no volume to achieve its effect. The call comes to ship oars, and the rhythm that has governed the hours breaks into a more complex pattern of individual movement, each man lifting his oar from the port, shipping it through, laying it lengthwise along the deck in the ordered rows that will keep them ready for the time when rowing is again required. The blades point forward, the handles aft, and the long shafts make a geometry of parallel lines that speaks of discipline and the accumulated knowledge of voyages beyond counting. You feel the sudden silence when rowing ceases, that profound exchange of one world of sound for another, the absence of the creaking, the breathing, the soft percussion of wood in wood replaced by the wind and water noise that was always there beneath but could not be heard until the human effort paused. The ship seems for a moment to hang in the water, to lose its purpose, to become merely a floating thing without direction or will, and then the wind freshens from astern and the true business of the morning begins. The mast has been laid along the deck since the calm began, unstepped and secured by lashings that the crew now work to release. It is a single tall timber, shaped from the straight trunk of some high-latitude fir, and it has been chosen for this vessel with the care that men bring to the selection of something that must stand between them and the indifferent forces of the world. You watch as 4 men lift the heavy mast, their bodies braced against the deck's slight roll, their hands finding the balance points that practice has taught them. They step it into the keelson, that carved socket in the ship's backbone that receives the mast's heel and holds it against the pressures that will come. And the vibration of the mast, transmitted through the deck planking, reaches your feet as a new kind of presence, a vertical energy where before there had been only the horizontal motion of oars and hull. The forestay is drawn forward and secured, the shrouds made fast, and the mast becomes a thing that stands, that asserts itself against the sky, that transforms the ship from a rowing vessel to a sailing one by the simple fact of its erection. The yard has been stowed beneath the mast, and now it too is raised, the crew working in the watches that have organized their labor since the voyage began, though the specific organization varies by voyage and captain, and no single pattern can be said to govern all such ships. The sail, which has been furled and lashed against the yard through the hours of calm, begins its descent in a sudden billow of striped wool, the red and white bands that mark this vessel's identity unfolding like a flower forced by unnatural haste. The heavy smell of wet wool rises as the sail first takes moisture from the air, that particular dense odor of damp animal fiber that speaks of shelter and warmth and the domestic world left behind, that carries in its molecules the memory of sheep on hillside pastures and the hands of women who wove and fulled, and finished this cloth for purposes they could only partly imagine. You breathe it in, this smell of wool and sea air combined, and feel the complexity of what a voyage entails, the web of land-based labor that extends behind each moment of maritime action. The first fill of wind heals the ship slightly, and you feel the changing angle in your inner ear, your body's adjustment to new balance happening before thought can intervene, the ancient mechanism of the labyrinth responding to tilt and acceleration with the immediacy that has preserved your kind through ages of uncertain footing. Men shift their weight instinctively, their bodies knowing what their minds might need moments to comprehend, the whole crew becoming for an instant a single organism, adjusting to altered conditions. The steersman leans into his quarter rudder, his constant responsibility now expressed in new terms, the pressure of wind-driven water against the blade, requiring continuous attention of a different quality than the steady resistance of oar-propelled motion. You see the muscles of his forearm stand out beneath the skin as he holds the ship against the first enthusiasm of the sail, as he persuades the hull to accept the wind's gift without surrendering to it entirely. The complex sound of the sail as wind fills it reaches you now, a low rumble at first, the woolen cloth shaking off its dormancy and beginning to assert its shape against the sky, then a steady pressure as the aerodynamics establish themselves and the sail becomes a wing, a curve of purpose that transforms invisible force into visible motion. The sound is not like the snap and crack of later centuries' canvas, but something more substantial, more earth-derived, the voice of animal fiber straining against its limits and finding within those limits a capacity for work that the sheep who grew this wool could never have imagined. The mast hums with the tension, a deep note that you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears, the vibration passing through the deck planking and into the bones of those who stand upon it, so that the ship becomes not merely a vessel but a sounding box, an instrument played upon by wind and water and the collective will of those who have learned to ride upon the surface of the sea. The square sail is most efficient with the wind abaft the beam, and this morning's fortune has brought exactly that condition, the breeze settling upon the quarter with the steadiness that sailors pray for and so rarely receive. You watch the sail assume its true shape, the yard braced round to catch the wind at the optimal angle, the striped wool drawing into curves that speak of forces in balance, of pressures resolved into forward motion. Sailing with the wind, a longship could achieve speeds of 10 to 12 knots, and though you have no means to measure this vessel's pace beyond the intuitive reckoning of water-passing hull, you feel the acceleration as a change in the ship's voice, the bow wave developing a new note, the wake spreading in a broader pattern of disturbed water that marks the transition from oar power to sail power, and all that this implies for the hours ahead. The men who have finished with the sail make their way aft and forward, finding positions that will keep them available without obstructing the working of the ship. Some settle among the ordered rows of stowed oars, their bodies finding the spaces between the long shafts with the ease of long practice, their hands falling upon the timber as upon something familiar and almost companionable. The oars rest now in the passivity of completed labor, their blades drying in the wind, their handles still bearing the warmth and moisture of the hands that have released them. You notice how the light falls upon this stored equipment, how the wet wood gleams in bands where the water has not yet evaporated, how the whole arrangement speaks of a world in which things have their places and their times, in which the transition from one mode of being to another is accomplished with the minimum of confusion and the maximum of collective understanding. The rhythm changes from the pull of oars to the steady surge of sailing, and you find your own body adjusting to this new cadence, the former necessity of matching your breathing to the stroke, now replaced by a different kind of attention, a broader awareness of the ship's motion as a continuous present rather than a series of discrete efforts. The hull lifts and settles with a longer period, the waves passing beneath at a pace that speaks of speed, of distance being made good, of the gradual accumulation of westing that will bring the voyage to its eventual terminus. The wind holds steady, and with it the sail's shape, and the complex sound becomes not an event, but a condition, the background against which other sounds must now be distinguished. The creak of the forestay in its block, the small slappings of water against the hull's side where the freeboard is lowest, the distant cry of a bird that has appeared from somewhere to investigate this intruder upon its ocean. The captain has resumed his seated position, his posture suggesting less repose than readiness, the habit of command expressed in the angle of his head as he watches the sail, the set of his shoulders as he receives reports from those who move about the deck on necessary business. Crews worked in watches, though the specific organization varied by voyage and captain, and you sense around you the shift in alertness as those who have rowed through the night find their replacements, as the labor of sailing becomes distributed across the hours in patterns that preserve strength and maintain vigilance. The steersman has not changed, or perhaps has changed so recently that the transition has escaped your notice, his quarter rudder requiring continuous attention that no watch system can relieve entirely. You observe how he stands, how his weight distributes itself against the ship's motion, how his eyes move constantly between the sail and the horizon and the small telltale ripples that mark the wind's variations upon the water's surface. The sun has risen now above the cloud bank that held it, and the light falls upon the sail in a way that transforms the striped wool into something almost luminous, the red bands glowing with a depth that seems to come from within the fibre itself, the white bands becoming sources rather than reflectors of illumination. The heavy smell of wet wool has given way to something drier, the wind's passage through the cloth carrying away the last vestiges of dampness and leaving only the clean animal scent of worked fibre in active use. You feel the warmth of this light upon your face, the first true warmth of the day, and with it a sense of the ship's small world as complete and sufficient, as containing within its wooden boundaries everything necessary for the continuation of life and purpose across the distances that separate one shore from another. The hours of sailing accumulate in the manner of such hours, each one like the last in its broad character, yet unique in its particulars, the wind varying by fractions that the steersman feels and responds to, the sail adjusting its shape to pressures too subtle for untrained perception. You find yourself moving about the deck with the freedom of one who has been accepted into this temporary society, your presence no longer remarkable, your movements anticipated and accommodated by those whose business brings them near. The vibration passing through the deck planking has become so constant as to be almost unnoticed, yet you test for it now and then, placing your palm flat against the gunwale or the mast itself to confirm that the deep note continues, that the ship's music has not faltered, that the forces in balance remain balanced, and the voyage proceeds as it should. The changing angle of heel felt in your inner ear becomes over time a kind of language, the ship's slight leans speaking of gusts and lulls, of the water's changing resistance, of the subtle negotiations between wind and hull and rudder that constitute the art of sailing. Your body's adjustment to new balance has become automatic, unconscious, so that you find yourself leaning into a gust before you have consciously registered its arrival, your weight shifting with the ship's as if the two have become a single system, a single organism adapted to this particular medium and this particular mode of transport. The men around you exhibit the same adaptation, their movements fluid and uncalculated, the product of experience rather than instruction, of time spent in this environment rather than theoretical knowledge of how it should behave. The morning passes into what might be called late morning, though the sun's position is the only clock that matters, the only measure that governs the ship's affairs. The wind holds, and with it the speed, the 10 to 12 knots that a longship could achieve sailing with the wind, maintaining themselves across the hours with a steadiness that seems almost deliberate, as if the weather itself has taken an interest in this voyage success. The complex sound varies now with the wind's small changes, the low rumble rising and falling in intensity, the steady pressure expressed in different registers. And you find in this variation something like the interest of music, a composition that never repeats yet never departs from its essential nature, that offers the mind just enough engagement to prevent the boredom of absolute sameness, without demanding the active attention that would constitute distraction. The captain speaks occasionally, his words carrying to those who need them without effort, his voice part of the ship's soundscape in the way that the wind and water are part of it, present and meaningful without being insistent. Orders regarding the brace, the sheet, the small adjustments that keep the sail at its optimal shape pass among the crew and are executed with the minimum of fuss. The coordinated labor and clear commands that shifting from oars to sail demanded now established as the normal mode of operation. The extraordinary become ordinary through repetition and success. You observe how the forestay takes its strain, how the shrouds stand taut against the mast's slight bend, how the whole system of wood and rope and wool accepts the forces applied to it and transforms them into the forward motion that is the ship's purpose and its meaning. The water changes color as the morning advances, the gray of early light giving way to a deeper blue-green that speaks of depth and clarity, of ocean that has not been disturbed by land's proximity or the turbidity of river mouths. You lean at the rail and watch the hull's passage through this medium, the small bow wave curling away in patterns of foam and disturbed water, the occasional flash of silver where a fish breaks the surface in flight from some predator below. The air holds a freshness that seems to come from vast distances, from the unpeopled regions that lie ahead, and you breathe it with a sense of privilege, of participation in something that the land-bound can never fully comprehend, this communion with wind and water that constitutes the seafarer's particular form of wealth. The sail area has been balanced to the hull with the care that this calculation demands, too much canvas risking the overwhelming of the lightweight ship, the capsize or the structural failure that would end the voyage in catastrophe. You can see this balance expressed in the ship's behavior, the amount of heel that the wind produces remaining within comfortable limits, the hull's rise and recovery from each wave, maintaining its rhythm without the desperate urgency that would speak of margin exhausted. The knowledge that governs this balance is not written, but carried in the minds of those who design and build and sail such vessels, transmitted across generations through the medium of observation and participation, the apprentice becoming the master through years of exposure to the consequences of getting it right or wrong. The steersman's face, when you venture aft to observe his work more closely, shows the concentration that continuous attention demands, yet shows also something else, a kind of contentment or absorption that comes from perfect engagement with a task that matches one's capacity. His eyes move constantly, yet his body remains relaxed, the tension in his arms and shoulders the productive tension of appropriate effort rather than the strain of overreaching. He speaks to you, or perhaps speaks to himself with you as incidental audience, words about the wind's holding, about the day's making, about the landfall that should come by evening if the weather holds as it promises. You respond with words that seem adequate, that join the general flow of shipboard communication without requiring or receiving special attention, and return to your place amidships with the sense of having touched something important, of having witnessed the center of the ship's operation, if only for a moment. The rhythm of the sailing hours establishes itself as a kind of counterpart to the rowing rhythm that preceded it, different in character yet similar in function, a pattern that organizes time and effort and attention into sustainable units. The sudden silence when rowing ceased, replaced by wind and water noise, has become itself a memory, something recalled rather than experienced, the present sounds having established their own dominance over consciousness. Yet you find, in certain moments of relative quiet, that you can almost reconstruct that earlier world, can almost feel in your shoulders the pull that has been given up, can almost hear beneath the sail's complex voice the simpler percussion of oars in oar ports, the chant that set the pace for labor that was primarily human rather than primarily natural. The sun reaches its height, and with it the wind seems to steady into its most reliable form, the gusts and lulls of morning giving way to a more consistent flow that fills the sail with a constancy approaching perfection. The ship heels to a steady angle, and the changing angle of heel felt in your inner ear becomes itself steady, your body's adjustment to new balance complete, the equilibrium between inner and outer achieved in a way that permits attention to wander, to observe, to participate in the ship's life without the constant small corrections that new conditions demand. The men eat where they stand or sit, dried fish and hard bread and water, passed hand to hand with the informality that hunger and custom permit, the watches continuing their rotation, the steersman receiving his relief with a nod, and a brief exchange of position that transfers the quarter-rudder's burden without interrupting the ship's course. The afternoon light begins to slant, the sun's path carrying it toward the western quadrant that the ship herself pursues, and the sail's stripes take on a warmer tone, the red becoming richer, the white becoming cream, the whole composition speaking of the day's advancing and of the eventual approach of evening. The vibration passing through the deck planking continues, perhaps has intensified slightly with the wind's small increase, and you find yourself once again testing for it, confirming its presence, drawing from it the reassurance that the ship's structure remains sound, that the forces applied to it remain within its capacity to absorb and transform. The heavy smell of wet wool is now entirely memory, replaced by the dry warmth of cloth that has been worked by wind for hours, that has given up its stored dampness to the passing air and become something lighter, more responsive, more fully itself. The horizon that has been empty begins to show signs of the land that the captain's reckoning has predicted, a faint darkening at the base of the sky that might be cloud or might be the first indication of shore. The complex sound seems to you now to carry an extra note, an anticipation or a preparation for the change that landfall will bring, the transition from open water sailing to the more demanding navigation of coastal waters. Men move with new purpose, though nothing has been said, the general awareness of approaching destination expressing itself in individual preparations, in the checking of equipment that will be needed, in the small adjustments of clothing and position that mark the psychological shift from the mode of passage to the mode of arrival. The steersman, whether the same who has held the quarter-rudder through the afternoon or another who has relieved him, begins to make small alterations in the ship's heading, anticipating the course changes that coastal navigation will require, his continuous attention now directed toward new challenges, new variables, the relative simplicity of the open water run giving way to the complexity of land-influenced wind and current. You feel these alterations in your body before you comprehend them intellectually, the changing angle of heel felt in your inner ear registering each shift as it happens, your body's adjustment to new balance becoming once again active rather than automatic, the equilibrium requiring effort rather than merely maintaining itself. The land becomes definite, a line of darkness resolving into forms that speak of hills, of cliffs, of the particular silhouette that distinguishes one coast from another in the experience of those who know them. The sail's shape alters as the wind begins to feel the land's influence, the steady pressure of the open ocean giving way to more variable conditions, the complex sound becoming more complex still, adding the notes of uncertainty and adjustment to its earlier confidence. The captain stands now, his voice carrying orders that prepare for the eventual reduction of sail, for the shift from the speed of the open reach to the caution of approach, for all the accumulated wisdom of bringing a ship from the freedom of the sea to the constraints of the shore. The men who have rested through the afternoon watch rise and make themselves ready, their movements suggesting the possibility of renewed oarwork, of the return to the primary means of propulsion in calms or against the wind that has governed this vessel's design and this crew's training. The oars, still stowed in their ordered rows, blades forward, handles aft, await the hands that will lift them, that will work them through ports in the ship's side, that will restore the human rhythm to supplement or replace the wind's gift as conditions demand. You find yourself standing at the vessel's forward rail, where the oak curves down to meet the grey waterline, and the wind has carried away the last warmth of the previous watch's conversation. The cold weight of the sun's stone rests in your palm, its optical properties shifting with angle as you tilt it slowly against the northern light diffused through complete overcast, searching for the hidden sun's polarization in a sky that offers no direct reference point for the Viking navigation that relied on observation of natural phenomena rather than instruments. Around you, the open ocean stretches without boundary, its surface moving in long undulations that speak of distant forces, of weather systems born far beyond the curve of the world that you and this vessel inhabit together. The particular quality of northern light diffused through complete overcast creates a flatness that eliminates shadow, that renders the horizon uncertain, that challenges the eye's accustomed methods of measuring distance and depth. You feel the rhythmic passage of the ship through swell, the period and direction read through the feet, a language learned across years of standing where you stand now, of attending to the vessel's conversation with the water beneath its hull. The smell of the open ocean surrounds you, salt and something vegetal, the plankton bloom, a living thickness to the air that speaks of waters still capable of generation, still distant from the sterile cold of the far northern reaches. Somewhere to starboard, the distant cry of a petrel carries across water, thin and searching. A voice that has evolved to travel farther than sight can reach in these conditions. The navigator stands forward, studying the intersection of two swell patterns where the longer period waves from the northwest meet a shorter, more urgent set from the northeast, creating a geometry of water that holds information for those trained to read it. His body is still, his weight distributed evenly across the deck's slight roll, his gaze moving systematically across the surface as a reader moves across a manuscript, gathering meaning from the arrangement of familiar signs. You observe how his feet adjust unconsciously to each shift, how his hands hang loose at his sides, how the accumulated knowledge of the route lives in this posture, in this patience, in this willingness to wait for the water to disclose what it will disclose in its own time. The sun's position gave latitude information when visible. Its absence in high latitudes created challenges that demanded other skills, other attentions, other forms of literacy. The watercolor shifts from deep blue-green to something lighter, undefined, a change so gradual that you cannot mark its beginning, only its arrival at your present perception, like a memory forming or a name returning after long absence. The surface seems to hold more light than the sky above it offers, as if the water itself were becoming luminous, as if depth were giving way to something shallower, something closer to the touch of wind and the penetration of the weak solar radiation that filters through the cloud deck. You think of river mouths, of the sediment they carry, of the way fresh water spreads across salt water, altering its color, its density, its behavior, though no river has been charted in these waters, though the knowledge you possess speaks of open sea for many days yet to come. The cold weight of the sun's stone in your palm reminds you of other possibilities, other interpretations, other reasons why the sea might change its appearance without changing its fundamental nature. A petrel circles the ship 3 times before continuing on its direct line, its flight effortless, its wings adjusting to each gust and lull with a precision that speaks of evolutionary time, of generations selecting for exactly this economy of movement, this extraction of energy from the moving air. You track its path, noting how its circles tighten, how its proximity to the vessel suggests curiosity or perhaps the expectation of disturbance, of the food that follows human passage through these waters. Seabirds indicated proximity to land. Different species were associated with different distances from shore, and the petrel's presence here, its behavior, its eventual departure along a line that seems to hold purpose, speaks to the navigator as it speaks to you, though neither of you can yet articulate what message it carries. The flight patterns of birds at dawn and dusk revealed the direction of their nesting grounds, and you mark the angle of this one's departure against the uncertain north, storing the observation with the others that accumulate across a voyage, that gradually assemble into a pattern, a probability, a basis for decision. The rhythmic passage of the ship through swell continues, each wave lifting and releasing the hull with a regularity that suggests stable conditions, a steady wind, a sea state that permits the maintenance of course without struggle or constant adjustment. Through your feet, you read the long, slow heave that speaks of deep water, of fetch sufficient to organize the surface into these coherent forms, of no immediate obstruction to the energy that travels from its distant source to your present moment. The smell of the open ocean intensifies, perhaps thickening as the water temperature shifts, as nutrients rise from below to meet the weak light, as the living surface of the world performs its ancient chemistry without reference to your passage through it. The navigator holds a crystal stone to the overcast sky, seeking the hidden sun's polarization in a gesture that connects this moment to others across the span of Norse seafaring, to the accumulated tradition of those who found their way through conditions that defeated less prepared, less attentive travelers. The sun stone, mentioned in later Icelandic sources, may have been a polarizing crystal used to locate the sun through cloud, and you watch the play of light across its surface, the subtle brightening and dimming that might indicate direction, that might offer the reference point that the overcast sky withholds. Archaeological evidence for sun stones includes a calcite crystal found in a 16th century shipwreck, a material confirmation of practices described in texts whose own dating remains uncertain, whose relationship to actual voyaging techniques continues to generate scholarly debate even as the navigator's hands demonstrate a confidence that precedes and perhaps exceeds academic understanding. The particular quality of northern light seems to respond to the stone's presence, to concentrate around it, to offer through its optical properties a communication between the hidden sun and the searching eye. You do not expect to read this signal yourself, not with the navigator's trained precision, not with the years of practice that distinguish professional knowledge from the broader competence of the crew. Yet you find your gaze following his, your attention attuned to the possibility of revelation, to the moment when pattern emerges from apparent randomness, when the stone speaks its single word of orientation in a language otherwise unavailable. Experience and oral tradition transmitted navigational knowledge across generations, and you stand within this chain of transmission, this continuous thread of practice and observation that binds the present to the past without requiring written record or formal instruction. The distant cry of a petrel reaches you again, or perhaps another petrel, the call indistinguishable to your ear, though the navigators might pass distinctions of individual or species, might hear in its timbre or rhythm information that escapes your perception. The sound carries across water with a clarity that the overcast dampens in other registers, the high frequencies traveling where the visual world contracts and flattens, where color drains towards gray, where distance becomes uncertain. You feel the cold weight of the sun's stone as the navigator returns it to its pouch, the transaction of observation completed for this interval, the information absorbed and held in memory against the need for confirmation, for triangulation, for the gradual building of confidence that precedes any decision to maintain or alter course. Wave patterns carried information about distant land masses and weather systems, and you study the intersection of forms that the navigator has already observed, trying to recover what his trained perception has gathered from the same field of phenomena that presents itself to your less prepared attention. The longer swell from the northwest persists, its period suggesting generation far to windward, perhaps beyond the Greenland coast, perhaps in the open Atlantic, where no land interrupts the wind's accumulation of energy across thousands of leagues of water surface. The shorter set from the northeast speaks of something nearer, of local conditions, of the interaction between wind and water that produces this more urgent, less organized pattern. Swell direction could indicate the presence of land upwind, as waves refracted around obstacles, and you consider what obstacle might lie in that quarter, what coastline or shoal or ice field might be bending the energy of the sea towards this convergent point where you stand observing. The color of the sea changed with depth and proximity to river mouths, and you return to this observation, to the lighter, undefined quality that has replaced the deep blue-green of the morning watch, wondering if it represents a shoaling of the bottom, a thickening of the surface life, a distant influence of fresh water that your charts do not predict. The rhythmic passage of the ship through swell continues its teaching, the period and direction felt through the feet offering their constant commentary on the state of the world beneath the hull, on the consistency of conditions, on the trustworthiness of the present moment as a guide to the immediate future. The smell of the open ocean seems to shift in character, to gain an additional note that you cannot identify, that might be imagination or might be the first intimation of some change that fuller attention will confirm. Floating vegetation and driftwood marked ocean currents and potential landfalls, and you scan the visible surface for such signs, for the material evidence of proximity to the vegetated world that your voyage has left behind. The empty sea offers nothing in this register, no leaf or branch or waterlogged timber to confirm or deny the hypotheses that the changing color, the bird's departure, the intersecting swells might suggest. Yet absence itself speaks, the absence of flotsam arguing for continued distance from any significant coastline, for the persistence of open ocean conditions that the voyage planning anticipated, that the accumulated knowledge of the route has prepared for. You find yourself breathing with the swell, your body adjusting to its period, your own rhythms falling into synchrony with the larger motion that contains and carries you. The navigator turns from his forward station, his movement deliberate, unhurried, carrying with it the weight of observation processed and held in readiness for the moment of communication. His path across the deck brings him past your position, and you fall into step, or rather into parallel stillness, as he pauses where the steering oar projects from the vessel's stern, where the steersman maintains the course that the wind and the sail and the current between them have established. A discussion with the steersman about holding course versus bearing slightly north unfolds in tones too low for general hearing, in the private register of professional consultation, of shared responsibility for the vessel's safety and progress. You catch fragments, enough to understand that the navigator's observations have generated a question, a possibility, a fork in the path of decision that must now be resolved through dialogue, through the weighing of alternatives, through the trust in accumulated knowledge that permits confident action in conditions of uncertainty. The particular quality of northern light seems to thicken as the afternoon progresses, if afternoon it still be, the uniform grey deepening towards a darkness that might precede night, or might be merely the passage of denser cloud, the approach of weather that will alter all the conditions that have governed the day's navigation. You stand at the margin of this exchange, present but not participating, your role that of witness, of one whose broader awareness of the vessel's situation includes this moment of decision without requiring active voice in its resolution. The distant cry of a petrel, thin and carrying across water, punctuates the low conversation, a reminder of other intelligences at work in this environment, other forms of reading and responding to the world's signals that proceed without the intervention of human intention. You think of whale behavior observed, of certain species followed, of the predictable migration routes that hunters and navigators alike have learned to anticipate, to use as additional reference points in the construction of spatial knowledge, in the building of mental maps that extend far beyond any individual voyage direct experience. The smell of land, vegetation, smoke, or earth could be detected before visual contact, and you find yourself sampling the air unconsciously, searching for some hint of the terrestrial in the oceanic compound that surrounds you, some trace that would confirm the hypotheses of proximity that the navigator's observations have raised. The open ocean maintains its character, salt and something vegetal, the plankton bloom offering no such confirmation, yet you know that the sense of smell operates below conscious threshold, that detection may precede recognition, that the body may know before the mind articulates what it knows. The stars provided orientation at night, though their use is less documented than solar navigation, and you look upward automatically, though the overcast permits no such reference, though the coming darkness will offer only the same grey uniformity that the day has provided, the same challenge to wayfinding that the sun, stone, and the swells and the birds must answer. The discussion with the steersman reaches some point of provisional conclusion, some agreement to continue observation, to hold the present course while gathering additional information that might support or undermine the case for alteration. The decision to maintain heading, trust in the accumulated knowledge of the route, emerges not as dramatic declaration, but as gradual settling, as the default position that requires no positive action, no active change, only the continuation of what has been established. You recognize this pattern, the way groups move towards resolution, the way individual uncertainty is absorbed into collective practice, the way the burden of decision is distributed across time and across persons, until the moment of commitment becomes indistinguishable from the moment of mere continuation. The navigator returns to his forward station, his movement carrying now the slight relaxation of responsibility temporarily discharged, of observation to be resumed rather than action to be initiated. You remain at the rail, your position chosen without deliberation, your attention distributed across the multiple channels of information that the environment offers to those prepared to receive them. The water color shifts yet again, and you mark this, noting its persistence, its refusal to resolve into the clear meaning you seek, its insistence on remaining ambiguous, suggestive, open to multiple interpretations that only further observation, further passage of time and distance, will narrow towards certainty. Polynesian navigators, though from a different tradition, similarly used birds, waves, and stars for open ocean wayfinding, and you hold this knowledge as a kind of counterpoint, a confirmation that the problems of ocean navigation generate similar solutions across cultures, separated by vast distances and independent histories of development. The human capacity to read the world, to find in its manifold phenomena the information necessary for survival and movement, transcends the particular traditions that embody it, speaks to something fundamental in the species' relationship with its environment. You do not press this reflection, do not force it towards conclusion, but let it rest in the background of awareness as the present moment continues its unfolding, as the vessel continues its passage, as the light continues its gradual change towards whatever darkness or clearing the hours ahead may bring. Its optical properties have demonstrated their utility, have confirmed the value of this particular technology, this particular refinement of the broader practice of Viking navigation that relied on observation of natural phenomena rather than instruments. You think of the calcite crystal found in a 16th century shipwreck, of the long continuity between that material evidence and the object you have just handled, of the generations of hands that have held similar stones to similar skies, seeking similar guidance across the similar challenges of northern waters. The northern light begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift, the grey lightening towards some source that you cannot locate, some change in the cloud deck that suggests the possibility of clearing, of the sun's eventual return to direct visibility, of the simpler navigation that direct observation permits. The rhythmic passage of the ship through swell maintains its steady testimony, the sea state unchanged by the atmospheric possibility, the hull rising and falling with the same measured cadence that has governed the day's movement. You feel your own breathing slow to match this larger rhythm, your body finding its place within the vessel's place, within the sea's place, within the turning world. The distant cry of a petrel comes once more, or perhaps it is another voice, another individual following the same routes, the same patterns, the same ancient imperatives of feeding and nesting that govern these creatures' lives without reference to the human observers who find in their behavior information for their own purposes. Seabirds indicated proximity to land, and you remember this, hold it as one element among many, one observation weighted against others in the gradual construction of navigational confidence. You mark the hour, the declining light, the approaching interval when such observation might yield its most reliable information, when the day's activity of these creatures reaches its peak, and their movements speak most clearly of the land that remains beyond your horizon. The smell of the open ocean maintains its presence, its character, its refusal to offer the additional note that might signal change, that might confirm or deny the hypotheses accumulating across the day's observations. You accept this, the patience that the environment demands, the willingness to wait for clarity that distinguishes the experienced traveler from the impatient, the anxious, the prone to premature conclusion and consequent error. The water color shifts yet again, and you observe this, noting its gradual intensification, the way it seems to spread across the visible surface as a kind of slow tide, independent of the wind-driven waves that move more rapidly across it. You watch his posture, its stillness, its readiness, the way he holds himself available to whatever the next moment of observation may disclose. You track its departure, marking the angle against the now slightly clearer sky, the lightening grey that suggests the overcast may indeed be breaking, may be offering before the day's end the direct solar reference that has been absent since dawn. The cold weight of the sun's stone would soon be unnecessary, its service rendered, its particular contribution to the day's navigation complete, until the next occasion of obscurity summoned it forth again. The rhythmic passage of the ship through swell continues, the period and direction felt through the feet gradually altering in some subtle register. The longer period from the northwest perhaps diminishing, the shorter from the northeast perhaps extending, the intersection of patterns shifting towards some new configuration that the navigator's trained perception will pass before your own more general awareness confirms it. The northern light has given way to something more variable, patches of brighter grey alternating with darker, the uniform field breaking into texture, into depth, into the visual information that permits the eye to locate itself, to measure distance, to recover the spatial competence that overcast suppresses. The smell of the open ocean seems to freshen, to gain some edge of wind that speaks of clearer conditions, of the atmospheric movement that has dispersed the cloud, that has restored the sky's capacity to offer reference and orientation. You feel this movement across your face, the cold air carrying its information of pressure gradient, of distant systems, of the larger weather patterns that govern this latitude at this season. The navigator holds the crystal stone to the sky once more, seeking the hidden sun's polarization in what may be the last occasion of the day, the final application of this particular technique before the clearing permits more direct methods. The optical properties respond to some residual polarization in the partly cleared atmosphere, offering a confirmation that aligns with the emerging visual evidence, that supports the confidence building across the day's accumulated observations. The discussion with the steersman resumes, or perhaps continues, the interval of separate observation now concluded, the moment of collective decision approaching with the day's gradual clearing. You catch enough to understand that the navigator's renewed observations support the provisional conclusion, that the case for holding course has strengthened rather than weakened with the gathering of additional information. The decision to maintain heading settles towards finality, towards the commitment that will govern the hours ahead, the night passage, the continued progress towards the destination that has shaped this voyage from its beginning. The rhythmic passage of the ship through swell offers its continued testimony, the subtle alterations you have noted perhaps now stabilizing, perhaps indicating that the vessel has passed some point of change, some boundary in the ocean's conditions that marks the transition from one regime to another. The distant cry of a petrel reaches you a final time, or what you take to be final, the day's light declining past the point of reliable observation, the interval of dusk approaching when the flight patterns of birds revealed the direction of their nesting grounds with particular clarity. You mark the sound, its direction, its relation to the vessel's heading, and to the angle of the petrel's earlier departure, assembling these elements into the provisional map that each day's observations construct, the mental chart that grows with each voyage, that accumulates across a career of passages, that constitutes the individual contribution to the experience and oral tradition transmitted across generations. The smell of land, vegetation, smoke, or earth remains absent from the air, though you sample it still, the unconscious search continuing below the threshold of deliberate attention, the body maintaining its vigilance while the mind turns towards other registers. The open ocean holds you, carries you, presents its surface for reading and its depths for speculation, offering no conclusion, no arrival, only the continuous present of passage, of movement through a medium that yields its meanings gradually, partially, to those who give it the patience and the respect that its scale and its power demand. You feel the rail beneath your hands, the oak worn smooth by countless grips in countless weathers, the wood holding the warmth of your touch even as the air cools around you, even as the day declines towards whatever night will bring. The navigator's voice carries back from his forward station, Not words, but tone. A note of satisfaction, or perhaps merely of recognition. Of the day's work reaching its proper close. Of observation giving way to the routines of evening. Of the watch change that will transfer responsibility to other eyes, other hands, other forms of attention that will maintain the vessel's progress through the hours of darkness. You do not move immediately, held by the particular quality of this interval, the suspended moment between day and night, between the overcast that has governed the hours behind, and the clearing that promises change ahead, between the accumulated uncertainty of observation and the provisional confidence of decision. The vessel rides the swell, the wind holds steady, the world continues its turning, and you stand at the rail, present to it all, receiving what it offers, giving what attention you have, participating in the ancient exchange between the human and the elemental that has carried so many across these waters before you, and will carry others after. The continuity of practice, of patience, of the willingness to venture beyond the sight of land, in search of what lies beyond. The smell of land, vegetation, earth, the particular sweetness of decaying plant matter, lingers at the edge of perception for a day after the last sighting of the Faroes has dropped below the rim of the sea. You stand at the leeward rail, and the wind that carried that memory now brings only the clean mineral emptiness of the open Norwegian sea, the vast grey corridor that separates the settled Norse world from the island lying somewhere ahead. The sky has lowered since morning, pressing downward in layers of deepening tone until the distinction between cloud base and sea surface has become uncertain, provisional, a matter of faith rather than observation. Around you, the deck of the Nar has grown slick with the accumulated residue of hours in this suspended atmosphere. Neither rain nor spray, but some intermediate precipitation that collects on every surface and finds its way through the weave of even the most tightly fulled wool. The cold salt spray rests upon your lips with a persistence that blurs the boundary between the moisture of your own breath and the moisture of the world that presses close against you. You taste it without choosing to, a mineral presence that has become as automatic as the air itself. Neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply there, the signature of this latitude, this season, this particular passage. The North Atlantic is characterized by frequent overcast and fog, especially in spring and early summer, and the season of your departure has carried you into the heart of this climatic pattern, the annual return of grey conditions that every mariner along these routes has learned to expect and to endure. The Viking route to Iceland crossed the Norwegian Sea, where fog is common, and you are travelling now upon waters that have swallowed the sight of countless vessels, that have tested the resolve of crews who set out with full hearts, and found their courage measured against the erasure of all familiar reference. The sound of voices carries strangely in this muffled world, falling flat against the dampened air, as if the fog itself were an absorbent surface that drinks the energy from speech. You hear the helmsman exchange a few words with the mate, and the syllables reach you with their edges rounded, their force diminished, intimate, without warmth. This particular quality of sound in fog creates an acoustic space unlike any other, a chamber without walls in which every utterance becomes a private confession, overheard by accident rather than addressed by intention. The ship moves through the water with a reduced sound as well, the slap of waves against the bow softened, the creak of timbers dampened to a lower register, the whole vessel seeming to hold its breath in deference to the grey that has enclosed it. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, or rather you are standing where the harbour would be if the harbour were visible, if the concept of harbour retained any meaning in a world where the horizon has dissolved into the general condition of greyness that surrounds you on every side. The visual absence of horizon troubles something fundamental in the mind's need for structure, for the line that separates above from below, for the certainty that the eye can travel outward and find a boundary against which to measure position and progress. Sea and sky, have become indistinguishable grey, a continuous field of tone in which the vessel exists as a small island of purpose, a constructed meaning floating in formlessness. You understand now why the psychological pressure of disorientation is recorded in saga literature as a theme of seafaring. This unmooring of the self from the confirming presence of landmarks, this surrender to instruments and techniques that must substitute for the direct evidence of the senses. The Norse navigators who preceded you upon this route developed their arts in response to exactly this challenge, the annual recurrence of conditions that stripped away the obvious and demanded the cultivation of subtler perceptions, the reading of wave patterns and bird flight, the interpretation of light even when its source remained concealed. Hours pass in monotone grey, the ship a small island of purpose in formlessness. The crew moves about their tasks with reduced conversation, the rhythm of rowing or sail adjustment continuing without the reinforcement of visible progress, each stroke or each adjustment contributing to a journey that cannot be verified by sight. You feel the chill that seeps through wool eventually, the body never fully warm despite the constant generation of heat through movement and effort. The cold rain and spray kept crews wet for days. Wool clothing provided insulation even when damp, and you are grateful for this property now, though gratitude itself has become a distant emotion, subsumed in the larger condition of endurance that grey weather imposes. The fabric of your cloak has reached a state of permanent saturation, heavy against your shoulders, yet still it traps the warmth your body produces. Still it maintains that narrow margin between discomfort and danger. Grey weather extended voyage duration unpredictably, straining provisions and morale, and you have begun to feel the first intimations of this strain in the careful rationing of dried fish, in the measured consumption of fresh water, in the glances that crew members exchange when they believe themselves unobserved. The provisions were calculated for a passage of known length, and the known has become uncertain, the estimated transformed into the indefinite. You think of the sagas you have heard recited in winter halls, the stories of voyages extended beyond their intended term, of crews reduced to desperate measures, of the bonds between men tested by the prolongation of conditions that neither improve nor dramatically worsen, but simply continue, day after day, in their grey uniformity. The return of clear weather after prolonged grey brought both relief and reorientation, and you find yourself anticipating this return with a desire that has no specific object, that is directed toward the simple restoration of visibility itself, the reappearance of a world that can be seen and therefore can be navigated, can be known. The navigator moves below deck, and you follow him with your eyes, tracking his progress until the hatchway swallows him. He returns with a small bundle wrapped in seal skin, the material greasy and dark with handling, and you watch as he unwraps it with the deliberation that this atmosphere demands, that seems appropriate to the gravity of tools brought forth in conditions of uncertainty. The sunstone appears in the Icelandic Rothskinna and Holler annals, though these are late sources, and the object that emerges from its wrapping carries the weight of this documentary fragility, this dependence upon texts composed centuries after the practices they describe. Yet the stone itself seems indifferent to questions of provenance and dating, a pale crystal that catches the diffused light with a particular quality, a gathering of luminosity that seems disproportionate to the greyness of its source. Calcite crystals, possible sunstones, polarize light and can reveal the sun's position through cloud, and you observe the navigator's handling of the object with the respect due to an instrument whose operation exceeds your own understanding, that belongs to a specialized knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship and guarded with appropriate care. He holds the crystal toward the region of sky where the sun's track would carry it at this hour, this season, this latitude, and you watch his face for the indication that the stone has found what the unaided eye cannot locate. The technique requires stillness, patience, a willingness to hold position, while the subtle properties of polarized light make themselves known through the crystal structure. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or rather they would be unloading their cargoes if there were a dock to receive them, a market to absorb their goods, the familiar rhythms of trade that have been suspended by this passage through grey. The image comes unbidden, the memory of harbours where the stone was not needed, where the sun fell direct upon decks and faces, and the business of exchange proceeded without the intervention of instruments designed for concealment and revelation. A break in the cloud reveals a patch of lighter grey, and the stone finds the sun's axis in that same interval, the navigator's body tensing with the confirmation of what his tool has suggested. You do not see the polarization directly, do not perceive the phenomenon that the crystal makes available, but you read its success in his posture, in the small movement of his free hand that marks a direction upon the Unartok disc, a wooden fragment with marked lines that may have been a bearing dial for navigation. The disc rests upon his knee, its surface marked with the accumulated notations of previous observations, the scratches and ink lines that constitute a personal record of passages, a material memory that supplements the oral tradition with its greater permanence. The course is confirmed or corrected in that brief interval before the sky closes again, the patch of lighter grey swallowed by the returning uniformity, the sun's position once more concealed, but now known, held in memory, and in the marking upon the disc, available for reference when the next opportunity presents itself. Breaks in weather were seized for position fixes. A glimpse of sun or stars was precious, and you understand the quality of this preciousness now, the value that attaches to moments of clarity in a prolonged condition of obscurity. The navigator wraps the stone again in its seal skin, the gesture completed with a tenderness that recognizes the object's importance, its role in the preservation of orientation when all other methods have been reduced to approximation. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, or standing where the harbour will be when the harbour emerges from grey, when the coastline of Iceland resolves from probability into actuality, when the volcanic mass of the island becomes visible against the eastern horizon that you have calculated but cannot yet confirm. The hours that follow return to their monotone, the ship continuing its progress through the formless grey, with only the internal instruments of dead reckoning to assure its crew that progress is made, that the island ahead draws nearer with each watch, each measured portion of the day. Hypothermia was a constant risk. Activity, rowing, bailing, generated necessary warmth, and you observe the crew's attention to this necessity, the rotation of tasks that ensures no one remains still for too long, the small movements of limbs and trunk that maintain circulation even in the enforced idleness of waiting. The chill that seeps through wool eventually, the body never fully warm, and you feel this seeping now as a condition rather than an event, the gradual establishment of a thermal equilibrium that favors survival without attaining comfort. The faint luminescence of wave tops in the prolonged dusk of northern summer offers the only visual variation in the grey, a subtle brightening where the water's movement catches what light filters through the cloud, a reminder that the world retains its capacity for beauty even in conditions of extremity. Ships could become lost in featureless grey, unable to determine drift or leeway, and you consider the mathematics of this uncertainty, the calculations of wind and current that must be performed without the confirming evidence of fixed points, the estimates that accumulate error with each hour of unverified progress. The Norse navigators developed techniques for reading these variables, the observation of wave patterns that indicated the presence of land below the horizon, the tracking of bird flight that revealed the location of nesting grounds, the whole complex of indirect knowledge that substituted for the direct line of sight that grey weather denied. You have learned some portion of these techniques, enough to appreciate their refinement, their adaptation to the particular challenges of these waters, this route, this season when the North Atlantic is characterized by frequent overcast and fog, especially in spring and early summer. The navigator returns to his position at the rail, the wrapped stone secure in his belt, the bearing dial marked with the observation that the break in the clouds permitted. He does not speak, and you do not speak. The silence between you appropriate to the muffled quality of sound in fog, voices falling flat against the absorbent atmosphere that surrounds the vessel. You taste the cold salt spray on your lips, constant, neither rain nor sea, and you mark the direction from which it comes, its relation to the wind that drives the ship, its consistency with the other indicators that assemble into the provisional understanding of position and progress. The mental chart grows with each voyage that accumulates across a career of passages, and you feel this growth even now, in the midst of conditions that deny confirmation, the incremental addition of experience to the store that will be drawn upon in future years, transmitted to successors through the same mechanisms of demonstration and repetition that brought it to you. The sky shows no indication of further breaks, the grey settling into what promises to be its permanent condition for this watch, perhaps for the day, perhaps for longer. The psychological pressure of disorientation is recorded in saga literature as a theme of seafaring, and you feel this pressure as a physical presence, a weight upon the chest that corresponds to the weight of the saturated wool upon your shoulders, the accumulated moisture of hours in this suspended atmosphere. Yet the pressure is not unbearable, has been borne by countless predecessors upon this same route, this same stretch of the Norwegian Sea where fog is common, and the passage to Iceland demands the full measure of navigational skill. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, or will be standing there when the dawn finally brings visibility, when the grey lifts to reveal the destination that calculation places somewhere ahead, that faith and technique maintain as the terminus of this passage. The day declines without the dramatic alteration of light that clearer conditions would bring, the sun's descent masked by the uniform cloud, the transition toward evening marked only by a gradual deepening of the grey, a shift from the lighter tone of midday to the darker register that indicates the approach of night. Night falls without true darkness, the northern latitudes holding residual light, and you observe this phenomenon with the attention that prolonged grey has trained, the sensitivity to subtle variation that becomes necessary when obvious contrasts are unavailable. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or would be if the passage had reached its term, if the conditions of trade had replaced the conditions of navigation, the settled routines of harbour life supplanting the suspended vigilance of the open sea. The navigator consults his disk again, the marks upon its surface visible in the residual light that the northern summer preserves, the lines that indicate the course confirmed by the sun, stone's brief revelation. The Unartok disk, a wooden fragment with marked lines, may have been a bearing dial for navigation, and you consider the history of this object, the hands that have held it, the voyages it has accompanied, the accumulated experience that its worn surface represents. The conjunction of these instruments, crystal and disc, optical and mechanical, the one extending perception and the other recording its results, suggests the sophistication of the navigational tradition that developed in response to these waters, this challenge, this annual recurrence of conditions that tested the limits of human orientation. The crew has settled into the reduced movement of the night watch, the minimum necessary to maintain the vessel's progress, to respond to any alteration in the conditions that the darkness might bring, though darkness itself is incomplete, modified by the prolonged dusk that holds at the edge of true night. You stand at the rail and attend to the sound of the water, the particular quality of its movement against the hull in these conditions of reduced visibility, the way that the absence of sight concentrates attention upon the other senses, the hearing that becomes more acute, the touch that registers variations in temperature and moisture with increased precision. The taste of cold salt spray on your lips continues, constant, neither rain nor sea, and you mark its persistence as a thread of continuity in the experience of this passage, an element that connects the hours into a single fabric of sensation. The visual absence of horizon, sea and sky, becoming indistinguishable grey, has ceased to trouble you with its initial disorientation, has become instead the normal condition of this voyage, the ground against which any variation will register with heightened significance, the return of clear weather after prolonged grey bringing both relief and reorientation when it finally arrives. The navigator has wrapped himself in his cloak, the wool heavy with moisture, but still performing its function of insulation, still maintaining that narrow margin between the discomfort of damp and the danger of cold. You consider the physics of the sun's stone, the way that the crystal's molecular structure filters the scattered light of the overcast sky to reveal the direction of its source, the sun's axis made visible through the intervention of mineral geometry. The knowledge required to use this instrument effectively to distinguish the polarization pattern from the general luminosity of the grey represents the accumulated sophistication of generations of observation, the slow refinement of technique that the late sources of the Rothskinner and Holler annals attempt to preserve, to transmit across the centuries that separate their composition from the practices they describe. The ship moves through the water with a steadiness that suggests the holding of course, the helmsman's hand upon the tiller guided by the bearing that the disk records, the sunstone's observation translated into the continuous adjustment that keeps the vessel oriented toward its destination. Yet the calculation is not desperate, not yet, the provision still adequate for the extended duration that experience suggests may be necessary, the morale still sustained by the competence of the crew, the skill of the navigator, the instruments that extend their capacity for orientation beyond the limits of direct perception. You observe this luminescence with the attention that the grey has trained, the patience that prolonged obscurity develops, the willingness to find significance in subtle variation that constitutes the navigational temperament, the psychological adaptation that seafaring literature records as necessary for survival. The cold salt spray rests upon your lips with the persistence of the hours, the taste that has become inseparable from the experience of this voyage, this watch, this prolonged interval of grey. The night continues in its incomplete darkness, the residual light of the northern summer preserving a visibility that would be impossible at lower latitudes, a greyness within greyness that permits the continuation of observation, of navigation, of the small tasks that maintain the vessel and its crew. The navigator has checked his disk again, the marks upon its surface still legible in the prolonged dusk, the bearing still held in memory and in material record. The sunstone remains wrapped in its seal skin, its moment of revelation past for now, its next employment awaiting the break in the clouds that may come with the return of day, or may not come, the weather holding its possibilities in reserve, revealing them only according to its own schedule, its own patterns of atmospheric movement that exceed human prediction even as they invite human observation. The crew moves about the deck with the reduced movement of the night watch, the conservation of energy that prolonged conditions demand, the recognition that the voyage may extend beyond its expected term, that the resources of body and spirit must be husbanded against uncertainty. The sound of breathing joins the muffled quality of other sounds in this fog, the particular acoustic of the grey world that makes each person audible to themselves, the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation becoming a measure of continued existence, a confirmation that the body persists in its function despite the withdrawal of the world's confirming presence. The particular muffled quality of sound in fog extends even to this internal sound, the breath that reaches your own ears with a quality of enclosure, of intimacy without warmth, the auditory equivalent of the visual absence that surrounds you. You taste the cold salt spray and hear your own breathing and feel the chill that seeps through wool. And these sensations compose the complete experience of this moment, this watch, this passage through the Norwegian Sea where fog is common and the route to Iceland demands the full measure of navigational art. The navigator has settled into stillness at his position, the disc upon his knee, the wrapped stone at his belt, the posture of one who waits with prepared patience for the next opportunity that the weather may provide. The sky shows no sign of alteration as the night progresses, the grey holding steady in its depth and uniformity, the prolonged dusk of the northern summer gradually deepening towards something that approaches true darkness without ever quite achieving it. The faint luminescence of wave tops persists, becomes more pronounced as the residual light diminishes, the water's surface marked by this subtle brightening that seems to belong to the waves themselves, to their internal motion, rather than to any external source. You observe this phenomenon with the attention that the conditions have trained, the patience that has become habitual, the willingness to find interest in subtle variation that constitutes the navigational temperament, the psychological adaptation that prolonged seafaring develops, and that the saga literature records as necessary for survival in conditions of extended uncertainty. The grey light of a northern morning spreads across the deck in thin layers, neither warm nor cold, simply present, a condition of visibility that asks nothing of you and offers only the chance to see what your hands are doing. You are standing near the mast step, where a man named Thorvald has set down a wooden bowl of some age, its grain darkened by repeated wetting and drying, its rim worn to a softer curve than the carpenter originally shaped. He reaches into a cloth bag at his waist and withdraws a piece of flatbread, the barley flatbread that was dried hard for storage before the voyage began, the flatbread that will travel with you toward the western settlements where grain does not grow. The flatbread is the color of winter fields, of sand after rain, of the pale wood beneath the bark of birch trees. He breaks it into pieces with his thumbs, working deliberately, allowing the fragments to fall into the bowl where they strike the wood with a sound like distant footsteps on frozen ground. Around you, other men are performing similar preparations, each according to his habit and his hunger, each with the same materials that the Nar carries in greater abundance than the Longship could manage. The Nar, with its broader beam and deeper hold, sacrificing the speed of the dragon-prowed vessel for the capacity to bear stores across long passages where no land offers replenishment. The flatbread was made from barley or oats, dried hard for storage and reconstituted with liquid, and now it requires that liquid, that careful ration of water carried in wooden casks or skin bags, carefully rationed on long passages where the next source of fresh water lies beyond the horizon's calculation. Thorvald lifts a small cask and pours water over the broken flatbread, the cold water in the wooden bowl, the flatbread softening slowly, releasing grain sweetness into the air around you, a faint aroma of sustenance that seems to thicken the grey light rather than dispel it. You watch the flatbread absorb the water, changing from pale stone to something more like dough, more like the food that women prepared on the farms you left behind, the farms that exist now only in the memory of your hands and the habits of your appetite. The cold water in the wooden bowl continues its work, the flatbread softening slowly, and Thorvald stirs the mixture with a wooden spoon, pressing the fragments against the bowl's worn interior, coaxing them toward edibility with the patience that prolonged seafaring develops, and that the saga literature records as necessary for survival in conditions of extended uncertainty. Other men nearby are eating their flatbread dry, cracking it with their teeth, accepting the labor of chewing as part of the cost of distance, as part of the contract between the body and the voyage it has undertaken. The hard, slightly rancid smell of dried fish reaches you before the fish itself appears, carried on the same air that moves the grey light across the deck. The smell of cod that has undergone the primary preservation methods of drying and salting. The cod that will sustain you when fresh meat proves impossible to obtain. A man named Bjarni approaches with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, and from this he produces the dried fish, each piece stiff as a plank, each piece measured by eye and experience into portions that will not satisfy but will suffice. The texture resistant to chewing is part of the preservation, part of the transformation that allows protein to cross the ocean in conditions that would spoil softer food within days. You receive your measured portion, feeling its weight in your palm, its dimensions familiar from the days that have preceded this one, and will follow it in patterns that watches divide the day and night. Though specific hour systems are not used in this floating world where the sun's height and the star's rotation provide sufficient structure for the needs of sailing. The distribution of dried fish proceeds along the deck, each man receiving his measured portion with the same ritual of acceptance, the same calculation of what hunger will permit and what the body requires for the work that waits. The Viking provisions for sea voyages included dried fish, flatbread, and preserved meat, and you have seen the preserved meat already, hanging in strips from the rail where the air moves across it, continuing the drying that salt began, the preservation that will not last forever, but will extend the possible duration of your passage beyond what fresh stores could manage. Nuts and dried berries provided concentrated nourishment and variety, and somewhere in the hold, these two await their turn in the rotation of appetite, the sequence of flavors that breaks the monotony of fish and grain, the monotony that is itself a condition to be endured with the patience that has become habitual. Thorvald has finished preparing his flatbread and now adds to it a piece of the dried fish, tearing the cod along its grain with his teeth, working the texture resistant to chewing into something that can be swallowed, that can become part of the body's slow combustion. You do the same, and the taste fills your mouth with the sea's own chemistry, with the memory of harbors where this fish was caught and prepared, the harbors that exist now only in the direction of your wake, in the diminishing possibility of return. The hard, slightly rancid smell of dried fish accompanies each bite, not unpleasant, but insistent, a reminder of what sustains you and what limits that sustenance imposes upon the imagination of other foods, other preparations, other lives. The sky has lightened further, though no sun has become visible through the cloud that presses down from the north, the cloud that carries in its color a suggestion of weather to come, of conditions that will test the working of the ship and the resilience of the men who work it. You finish your ration and feel the body's quiet gratitude, the temporary peace that follows intake, the willingness to find interest in subtle variation that constitutes the navigational temperament even in matters as simple as food. Around you, men are settling into the day's patterns, the watches that divide the day and night into manageable segments, the intervals between watches filled with the working of the ship, bailing, sail handling, repairs, the labor that maintains the vessel in its struggle against the water that surrounds and threatens it. 4 men have taken up their positions amidships, each with a wooden scoop shaped from pine or spruce, each with the stance of repetition, of movement learned and refined across days that have blurred into each other without the landmarks that would distinguish them. The bailing watch begins its rhythm, and you hear the water moving from the bilge to the deck, and from the deck to the sea. The rhythmic splash of bailing, water returning to the sea, it entered through the gaps between planks, the seams that no amount of caulking can permanently seal. The sound is not loud, but it is continuous, a percussion that marks time more reliably than any instrument, that accompanies the other sounds of the ship, the creak of strakes, the whisper of wind in rigging, the distant calls of seabirds that circle without landing. You move toward the stern, where a coil of walrus-hide rope lies on deck, its surface grey with salt and exposure, its fibers holding the memory of the animal's life in their twisted structure. A man named Einar is examining this rope, running it through his hands with the attention that the conditions have trained, feeling for weakness, for the internal decay that rot begins in secret before revealing itself in failure at the moment of greatest stress. Leather and rope required constant attention, drying and greasing to prevent rot, and Einar has prepared a small pot of rendered fat, the grease that will replace what the sea and sun have extracted, that will restore flexibility to fibers grown brittle with exposure. The greasy texture of rendered fat worked into rope fibers is part of the maintenance, part of the care that extends the possible duration of materials beyond what neglect would permit. You watch Einar work, his hands moving along the rope's length, pausing where his fingers detect some irregularity, some thinness or stiffness that speaks of damage beneath the surface. The grease gleams in the grey light, darkening the walrus hide to something approaching its original color, something like the wet stone of beaches where these animals were hunted, where their hides were processed into the materials of seafaring. The rope was made from walrus hide because this material resists the sea's chemistry better than lesser fibers, because the broad cargo ship, the Nar, requires stronger lines than the longship with its lighter construction and its sacrifice of capacity for speed. The Nar carried greater stores, and it required greater care, the attention of more hands to maintain its broader surfaces and heavier loads. Einar works in silence, and you do not disturb him, understanding that this labor admits no distraction, that the rope's integrity will be tested in conditions where failure means more than inconvenience. Weapons were maintained ready for use, both for defense and for hunting upon landfall, and though the rope is not itself a weapon, it belongs to the same category of preparation, the same principle of readiness that governs all aspects of life at sea. You leave him to his task and move forward, passing the bailing watch where the four men continue their steady rotation, the rhythmic splash of bailing marking your passage as you walk the deck's uncertain surface, adjusting to each roll with the automatic compensation that prolonged exposure has installed in your body. The morning has advanced without your notice, the grey light shifting in quality towards something that suggests the sun's position behind the cloud, the passage of time that watches divide the day and night without the precision of hours, without the mechanical regularity that other cultures have developed and that this voyage does not require. The working of the ship fills the intervals between watches, and you see now a man climbing the mast to adjust the rigging, his body small against the cloud, his movements deliberate and slow, conserving energy for the task rather than spending it in haste. The sail itself has begun to show wear at its corners, the strain of wind and weather working gradually upon materials that were new when the voyage began, that will be repaired or replaced according to need and availability. You find a place near the rail where you can observe without interfering, where your presence does not obstruct the patterns of labor that surround you. The particular quality of half-sleep on a moving deck, body tense against roll, is familiar to you from the night just past, from the brief intervals of rest that came rarely deep or prolonged. You did not sleep in a bed, for the Nar carries no such luxury, but in the space between crates and coils, in the angle where two surfaces meet, and offer some support to the body seeking rest. This quality returns to you now as a memory of sensation, the body tense against roll even in the moments of greatest relaxation, the refusal of complete surrender to unconsciousness that the conditions enforce upon the mind. The air has shifted, carrying now a colder thread from the north, a suggestion that the cloud may eventually deliver something more substantial than grey light. You pull your cloak more closely around you and feel the wool's texture against your neck, the smell of lanolin and smoke that clings to it from the fires of preparation, the fires that were possible on land and that cooking at sea limited by fire risk has largely replaced with cold rations, with the acceptance of food in the condition that storage permits rather than that appetite prefers. Cold rations were normal in rough weather, and the weather shows signs of approaching that condition, of demanding the caution that fire aboard a wooden vessel always requires, the vigilance that prevents small comforts from becoming large disasters. A man approaches with a skin bag, offering you drink, and you accept it, tilting the vessel to let the liquid reach your mouth. Fermented beverages, ale or whey, were preferred to water when available, for preservation and calories, and this is whey, sharp on the tongue, carrying the faint sweetness of milk transformed by bacterial process, by the same chemistry of preservation that governs the dried fish and the flatbread and all the other materials of survival. Water was carried in wooden casks or skin bags, carefully rationed on long passages, but the whey represents a supplement, a variation that the body welcomes after days of water's neutrality. You drink sparingly, aware of the rationing that governs all consumption here, the calculation of distance against supply that determines every aspect of daily life. The skin bag passes to another man, and you watch the distribution continue, each recipient measuring his gratitude against his thirst, each accepting the portion that custom and necessity have established. The Nar, a broader cargo ship, carried greater stores, and this includes the stores of drink as well as food, the capacity that its design permits, and that the longship with its narrower purpose must forego. The longship sacrificed capacity for speed, and you understand now the trade that this represents, the choice between arrival and endurance that every voyage must negotiate according to its purpose and its destination. The afternoon approaches with the imperceptible slowness of northern latitudes, the light changing by degrees that only accumulated attention can detect. The afternoon watch change will soon occur, and you observe the preparations for this transition, the subtle shifts in posture and attention that precede any formal announcement. Men who have been resting in the shelter of the cargo begin to stir, to emerge into the grey light with the slow movements of those whose sleep came in brief intervals, rarely deep or prolonged. The particular quality of half-sleep lingers in their faces, in the hesitation of their limbs as they remember the demands of waking, the body tense against roll even in the moments of emergence from rest. You watch Thorvald rise from his place near the mast, where he has been sitting with his back against the timber, his head fallen forward in the posture of the exhausted sailor who has learned to sleep in any position, in any condition of noise and movement. He stands slowly, allowing his body to adjust to the vertical, to the renewed demand of balance against the deck's continuous motion. The afternoon watch change proceeds without command, men rousing to take their places according to arrangements established in the voyage's first days and maintained by habit since, the watches that divide the day and night into segments of responsibility and segments of rest. The bailing watch ends its rotation, the 4 men with wooden scoops yielding their positions to 4 others who have appeared from various parts of the vessel, from the half-sleep that has occupied them during their off-watch time. The rhythmic splash of bailing continues without interruption, the new watch taking up the pattern as if no change had occurred, as if the motion itself generated the men who performed it rather than the other way around. You observe this continuity with the attention that the conditions have trained, the patience that has become habitual, understanding that this is how the ship survives, through the seamless replacement of effort by effort, through the willingness of each man to enter the pattern at the appointed moment and to sustain it until his own replacement arrives. Einar has finished with the walrus hide rope and now coils it neatly, the grease giving it a sheen that will gradually diminish as the sea works upon it again, as the cycle of exposure and maintenance repeats itself across the voyage duration. He stows the coil in its place and moves away, his task complete for this interval, his hands still carrying the residue of grease that soap and water will not remove until the next landfall permits such cleaning. The afternoon has settled into its own quality of light, the grey becoming somehow more substantial, as if the cloud had thickened rather than dispersed, as if the sun's hidden presence were pressing upon it, from above rather than seeking openings through which to emerge. You feel the cold air moving across your face, the persistent wind that drives the vessel forward and that extracts warmth from exposed skin with the efficiency of natural process. The cold air moves across your face and you accept it, as you accept the hard, slightly rancid smell of dried fish that persists even when no fish is visible, even when the meal that contained it has been finished for hours. The smell has become part of the atmosphere, part of the condition of being aboard this vessel, this gnar that carries you toward destinations you have not yet seen. A cry from forward draws your attention, a sound different from the usual calls of seabirds that circle without landing, different in its urgency and its direction toward the water rather than the sky. You move toward the source, joining other men who have converged from their various tasks, their various stations in the pattern of the afternoon. A seal has surfaced near the bow, its dark head visible against the grey water, its eyes perhaps observing the vessel with the same attention that you direct toward it, the same calculation of threat and opportunity that governs all encounters between species. Hunting at sea, seabirds, seals, fish, supplemented carried provisions when possible, and this possibility has presented itself with the suddenness that characterizes such moments, the brief window of opportunity that seafaring constantly presents and as constantly closes. A man named Grim has taken up a spear, one of the weapons maintained ready for use, both for defense and for hunting upon landfall, and now redirected toward this immediate purpose. He stands at the rail, his body coiled in preparation, his arm drawn back with the spear balanced for throwing. You watch the seal, watch the water around it, trying to anticipate the moment of movement that will precede the throw, the alignment of trajectory and target that chance and skill must achieve together. The seal surfaces nearby, visible for a moment longer than seems possible, as if it were studying the vessel with the same intensity that the men direct toward it, as if this encounter were mutual in ways that human perception cannot fully access. Grim throws, and the spear arcs across the narrow space of water, its flight visible and deliberate, its destination apparently certain. But the seal has submerged an instant before arrival, or the water's movement has carried the weapon astray, or some combination of timing and current has defeated the intention. A thrown spear misses, and the moment of fresh meat passes with the finality that such moments always possess, the opportunity that will not return in the same form, that exists now only in the memory of its possibility, and in the small disturbance of water where the spear has entered and disappeared. The men near you exhale in common disappointment, a sound softer than words, more expressive for its silence. The seal does not reappear, has descended to depths where the grey light does not penetrate, where the vessel's passage and the men's hunger are equally irrelevant. You remain at the rail for a moment longer, watching the water where the moment has passed, feeling the disappointment that is itself a form of hunger, a recognition of what might have varied the diet of dried fish and flatbread, of what might have restored to the mouth a taste of freshness, of life recently living. The moment of fresh meat passing leaves a residue of awareness, a sharpening of attention toward the water's surface that will persist for hours, for the remainder of this watch, and perhaps into the next, the vigilance that hunting at sea requires, and that the sea's indifference constantly tests. Grim retrieves his spear with a rope attached for this purpose, drawing it back across the water's surface with the same patience that Einar applied to the walrus hide rope, the same acceptance of effort without guaranteed result. He examines the weapon's point, checking for damage from its immersion, maintaining it in the condition that weapons were maintained ready for use. The working of the ship resumes around you, the patterns reasserting themselves after the interruption of possibility, the return to routine that is itself a form of survival, a refusal to permit disappointment to become despair. You move away from the rail, allowing the other men their own processing of what has occurred, their own adjustment to the continuation of conditions that the mist seal would have altered only temporarily. The cold air moves across your face again, carrying now a faint moisture that suggests the cloud's eventual intention, the weather that approaches from the north with the patience of natural process, unconcerned with human schedules or human needs. You find a place near the mast and sit, your back against the timber that Thorvald occupied earlier, your body assuming the posture of rest without the expectation of sleep. The afternoon continues in its grey duration, the light neither strengthening nor fading, but persisting in a condition that seems to belong to the latitude rather than the hour, to the season's tilt away from the sun rather than to any momentary configuration of cloud and wind. You observe the deck around you, the men moving through their tasks with the regularity that watches divide the day and night, though specific hour systems are not used, the organic rhythm of effort and rest that the body generates and that the voyage accommodates. A man passes with a wooden bowl similar to Thorvald's, containing the same preparation of flatbread and water, the same reconstitution of grain that will sustain the body for the next interval of labor. The cold water in the wooden bowl, the flatbread softening slowly, releases its grain sweetness into the air around him, the same faint aroma that you encountered in the morning that will persist through the voyage as a constant of experience, a marker of time's passage measured in meals rather than hours. The bailing watch continues its rotation, the rhythmic splash of bailing providing a background against which other sounds achieve their definition, the creak of strakes, the whisper of wind in rigging, the distant calls of seabirds that circle without landing. You listen to this composite of sounds, finding in it the same subtle variation that constitutes the navigational temperament, the willingness to find interest in conditions that repetition might render merely monotonous. The water returning to the sea it entered through the seams between planks completes a cycle that will begin again, that has been beginning again since the vessel first entered the water, since the first wooden ship first leaked, and first required the labor of bailing to remain afloat. Your body begins to signal its need for rest, the particular quality of half-sleep on a moving deck, body tense against roll, becoming desirable rather than merely familiar. Sleep came in brief intervals, on deck or curled among cargo, rarely deep or prolonged, and you understand now that the approaching evening will offer similar intervals, similar opportunities for the partial rest that the conditions permit. You do not seek your place yet, remaining in the grey light, in the cold air that moves across your face with the persistence of northern weather, of the climate that has shaped this voyage, and that will continue to shape it, until landfall provides some variation, some relief from the sea's constant demand for attention. The afternoon watch change has completed itself, the men who roused from half-sleep now established in their tasks, the men they replaced seeking the rest that their interval of labor has earned. You observe this transition without participating in it, your own role in the voyage pattern undefined by specific function, defined instead by presence and attention, by the willingness to find interest in subtle variation that constitutes the navigational temperament, the psychological adaptation that prolonged seafaring develops, and that the saga literature records as necessary for survival in conditions of extended uncertainty. A single voice rises from somewhere beyond the mast, directionless and intimate, as though the darkness itself has learned to speak. You do not turn toward it, for the darkness offers no face to seek, no gesture to read, only the timbre of words forming in the black air like breath visible in winter. The voice recounts the voyage of Bjarni Herjolfsson, the merchant captain blown off course in the summer of 986, his sails filled with wind he had not chosen, his keel cutting water toward lands no Norse eye had charted. Around you, other bodies shift in the woolen darkness, leather creaking, salt sweat mingling with the cold that seeps through the hull's timbers. The phosphorescence of disturbed water glimmers and fades beyond the gunwale, a brief green light extinguished by the ship's own passage, then kindled again by the next wave's disturbance. The voice carries no urgency, no demand for response, only the steady accumulation of detail that marks the trained reciter, the one who holds memory as others hold property or lineage. Bjarni Herjolfsson, the voice repeats, blown off course, his 3 lands sighted in succession, each different from the last, each named in the moment of seeing and later disputed by those who heard the tale second-hand. The resonance of the wooden hull beneath you serves as sounding board for this human voice, the planks transmitting vibration through the deck where you rest, through the frames and ribs that contain your small warmth against the greater cold. You feel the words as much as hear them, pressure in the chest rather than sound in the ear, the way one feels a drum struck in a distant room. The telling pauses, and in that pause you sense the listeners arrayed in darkness, the many men in close quarters, their wool and leather and salt sweat forming a dense atmosphere of human presence, a warmth measured in degrees against the night that presses against the hull. The voice offers a kenning, that familiar poetic puzzle that asks the listener to complete meaning from fragments. The serpent of the ocean, the horse of the sea, the whale's road. Around you, someone mutters the expected completion, the satisfaction of recognition passing through the darkness like a hand finding a handrail in an unlit passage. The voice acknowledges with a shift in tone, nothing so crude as praise, merely the continuation that follows comprehension, the thread resumed now that the pattern has been confirmed. A second voice takes up a different thread, lower and rougher, the voice of a man whose speaking has been shaped by different uses, perhaps command, perhaps dispute, perhaps the solitary labor of fields far from any hall. This voice speaks of 2 Icelandic farmers, their feud begun in a matter of grazing boundaries, and extended through 3 generations into killings and counter-killings, into the legal assemblies where words substituted for blades and failed, where blades resumed what words could not conclude. The darkness of northern nights, especially in autumn and winter, has extended the hours of storytelling across centuries of such voyages, across the long evenings when work cannot proceed and memory becomes the primary archive, when skilled reciters held respected status in crew and community, precisely because they could summon order from the threatening abundance of time. The rhythm of this second tale matches the motion of the ship, both carrying forward in their separate but parallel movements. You feel the hull rise and settle, the interval between each wave's passage roughly corresponding to the length of a clause in the speaker's unfolding syntax. The feud of the 2 Icelandic farmers, the voice continues, became the property of any who could recite it, the details adjusted to circumstance, the names preserved even when the sequence of events grew uncertain. Mythological references connected present voyagers to ancestral traditions, so that the farmers' quarrel became also a reflection of older divisions, of the enmity between families of gods, between forces that the merely human enacted without fully understanding. The phosphorescence returns, more strongly now as the ship's motion increases, the water disturbed to greater depth, the light spreading in sheets that fade before they can be fully observed. You watch this without moving, your body pressed closer for warmth to the bodies on either side, the cold that increases with night having established its presence in the gaps between coverings, in the air that moves when someone shifts position. The voice of the second speaker continues, recounting how the feud ended not in resolution, but in exhaustion, in the death of all who had known its origin, so that the later participants fought from obligation rather than passion, performed hatred as ritual without the heat that gives ritual meaning. A brief dispute interrupts the flow. Two voices from different quarters of the darkness offering contradictory sequences for the final killings. The second speaker had placed the ambush at the river crossing before the burning of the farmhouse. Another voice, younger and less certain, insists upon the reverse order, the fire first, the escape of survivors into the ambush prepared for exactly that flight. The darkness offers no visual confirmation, no ability to read in faces which version carries authority. The dispute settles by reference to common memory, to a third voice that offers not a decisive statement, but a compromise, a version in which both events occurred in neither order, the burning and the ambush simultaneous, the result of coordination between the two branches of the feuding family. This settlement satisfies not through logic, but through exhaustion, through the willingness of darkness and cold, and the lateness of the hour to accept any conclusion that permits rest. The figure of Odin, god of wanderers and poetry, held particular relevance for seafarers, and now the first voice returns to invoke him, not directly as subject, but as the atmosphere in which all tales of voyage move, the unseen presence that rewards the skilled reciter and punishes the careless with forgetfulness. Odin wandered to obtain the mead of poetry. The voice reminds the darkness. Odin hung upon the tree to obtain the runes, and so the act of voyage and the act of speaking become continuous with sacrifice, with the willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of what might be brought back. The poetic meters of Skaldic verse required technical mastery and were valued as high art, and the voice demonstrates this now with a passage in Drottfeet, the court meter, the syllables falling in patterns too complex for the untrained to follow, the effect one of density and precision rather than simple beauty. You feel the words in your chest again, the resonance of wooden hull making the complex meter physically present, a pressure that organizes itself and releases, organizes and releases, like the breathing of sleep. The smell of many men in close quarters, wool and leather and salt sweat, has become so familiar as to be unnoticed until some shift in position brings a new concentration, a pocket of air from some corner of the hull where circulation fails. The cold that increases with night has reached the point where movement seems wasteful, where the warmth generated by stillness, by the reduction of activity to essential minimum, exceeds what exertion might produce. The Vinland Sagas, Greenlandinga Saga and Eirik Saga Rother, describe Norse voyages to North America around 1000 CE, and now the first speaker turns to these, the greater voyage that contains and exceeds Bjarni Herjolfsson's accidental passage. Leif Eiriksson, the voice names, Leif Eiriksson, the lucky, the son of the outlaw, the one who followed Bjarni's reported lands with purposeful intent, who established the settlement that would be abandoned, that would persist only in the telling. The sagas attribute the abandonment of the Vinland settlement to conflict with indigenous peoples or internal disputes, and the voice offers both possibilities without choosing between them, the way memory preserves alternatives when certainty would be false. These sagas were transmitted orally before being written down in the 13th century, and the voice you hear now participates in that transmission. The centuries between its origin and its present sounding compressed into the single act of speaking, the way a wave contains all the weather that formed it. Saga literature preserves stories of voyages, battles, and settlements from the Viking Age and later, preserves them not as fixed texts, but as possibilities, as frameworks that each reciter completes with different emphasis, different selection of detail. The voice continues, recounting how Leif's voyage led to others, how Thorfinn Karlsefni attempted permanent settlement with livestock and women and the tools of agriculture, how the distance from Greenland proved too great for sustained contact, how the resources that had drawn them, timber, grapes, the good land itself, could not outweigh the vulnerability of their position. The phosphorescence has diminished, the sea's surface calmer now, the ship's motion gentler, the rhythm of the tale slowing to match. You observe this correspondence without participating in it, your own role in the voyage pattern undefined by specific function, defined instead by presence and attention, the way one defines the darkness by the small space of warmth one occupies within it. The voice speaks of the Skraelings, the indigenous peoples encountered in Vinland, the trade that began in curiosity and ended in conflict, the killing of Thorvald Eiríksson by a unipped arrow, the eventual retreat to the established settlements of Greenland and Iceland, where the stories of what had been attempted became more durable than the attempt itself. Archaeological confirmation came with the excavation at Elance Orks Meadows, Newfoundland, from the 1960, and you know this without the voice speaking it, the knowledge present in the darkness like another listener, another body pressed close for warmth. Elance Orks Meadows dates to approximately 1000 CE, consistent with saga chronology, and this consistency across the centuries, between the words preserved and the earth disturbed, offers a satisfaction different from the tale itself, the satisfaction of verification, of pattern confirmed by independent witness. The voice does not speak of archaeology, speaks only of the voyages as living memory, but the knowledge moves beneath the words like the phosphorescence beneath the hull, present without being named. Storytelling served multiple functions: entertainment, cultural transmission, and social bonding, and you feel all three in the darkness. The entertainment indistinguishable now from the fatigue that makes any sustained attention a kind of pleasure. The cultural transmission, a weight pressing equally on all who hear. The social bonding, the literal pressure of bodies. The shared warmth, the shared direction of listening toward a common source. The first voice has resumed the tale of Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course, Bjarni Herjolfsson, as though the circuit of the evening requires return to origin, the way a hall's architecture requires the speaker to stand where the acoustics concentrate, where the voice reaches all corners equally. The cold that increases with night has reached its plateau, the darkness its depth, the hour when the body most resents being awake, most insists upon the horizontal, the still, the surrendered. Yet the voice continues, and the listening continues, the obligation of transmission and reception that outlasts individual preference. Heroic exemplars in sagas provided models for conduct in hardship and conflict, and Bjarni's decision not to land, to continue sailing until he reached known settlement, becomes such a model, the prudence of the merchant who values return over discovery, who will not risk what he has for what he cannot know. The voice lingers on this, the quality of Bjarni Herjolfsson's choice, the way it differed from Leif's later purposefulness, from the heroic exemplars who rushed toward difficulty rather than away. The particular timbre of a voice speaking into darkness, directionless, intimate, has become indistinguishable from the darkness itself, from the cold, from the motion of the ship that you feel rather than observe, having lost the visual confirmation of movement, the stars or the horizon or the changing shape of waves. The voice speaks of memory as the primary archive, of how skilled reciters held respected status in crew and community, and you understand this status now as physical fact. The way the voice holds you in place prevents the drift towards sleep that would otherwise carry you away, the way a hand might steady another on a narrow path. The second voice returns, not to continue the feud, but to offer something else, a description of landscape, of the fjord where the farmers had originally been neighbors before they became enemies, the good hay meadows that both claimed, the salmon river that divided their holdings and connected them in dependence. The resonance of wooden hull makes this description present, the fjord's cliffs rising in the darkness of the listener's collective imagining, the water still and dark between them, the particular quality of light in northern summer when darkness never fully arrives, when the hours of possible work extend beyond the body's capacity to work. But this is autumn. The voice reminds itself, autumn and the voyage, the darkness of northern nights, especially in autumn and winter, extended hours of storytelling, extended hours of this. The phosphorescence returns in a final pulse, the ship passing through some disturbance in the water's layers, some meeting of currents or temperature that excites the living light. You watch it fade, the green becoming black, the distinction between water and air dissolving in the absence of light to mark their boundary. The voice has paused, and in the pause you hear what the pause contains. The wind in the rigging, the water against the hull, the breathing of men in sleep or near sleep, the creak of leather and wood and rope. The smell of many men in close quarters has become the smell of the place itself, no longer noticed as separate from the air one breathes, the way one does not notice one's own skin except when it hurts. The story ends. Silence returns, filled only by wind and water. The silence is not empty but full, the way a held breath is full of the expectation of its own release. You lie in it, the darkness complete now that the voice has withdrawn, the cold that increases with night pressing against the wool that contains your warmth, the bodies on either side having shifted to new arrangements of shared heat. The phosphorescence over the gunwale has ceased, the sea's surface too calm to disturb, or the depth of night too great for the light to penetrate to your eye. The resonance of wooden hull continues in memory, the last phrases still vibrating in the timbers, in the air, in the water that carries sound farther than light in this darkness. The ship moves forward, the wind holds steady, the voyage continues toward its unspoken destination. You're present in this continuation, your attention gradually loosening its hold, the particular timbre of voice giving way to the greater darkness that speaks nothing, that asks only that you remain, horizontal, warm, carried by the motion that matches the rhythm of your own blood, your own breathing, the slow tide of consciousness that rises and falls, like the hull upon which you rest, like the words that have passed through you and onward, preserved now in your own memory, your own archive of darkness and cold, and the voices that made them bearable. The darkness holds you still, horizontal, warm, the rhythm of blood and breathing continuing its slow tide as consciousness rises and falls upon the hull of your own rest. You are standing at the bow of a longship in the grey hour before dawn, somewhere in the North Atlantic, in the year 874, or perhaps 875, in the settlement period that began with Ingolfr Arnarsson's arrival, drawing Norse colonists from western Norway across the open water for decades to come. The air tastes of salt and old wood and the particular absence of anything growing, anything rooted, anything that does not move with the vessel's constant motion. Around you, the crew shifts in their places, not speaking, the silence of prolonged voyage having settled into them like water into wood. The light comes gradually, as it does at these latitudes, a slow dilution of darkness into grey into the palest silver, the sky enormous and empty, except for the seabirds that have begun to appear, more numerous now than in previous days, more purposeful in their flight, no longer the scattered wanderers of the open ocean, but birds with somewhere to be, something to seek. You feel the change in the air before you understand it, a quality of thickness, of weight. The smell of land before it is seen, vegetation and earth, and the particular absence of salt dominance that has governed every breath for days uncounted. The Norse colonists who came from western Norway, beginning in the 870, would have known this smell, would have learned to read it as the first true sign that their voyage approached its end, that the systematic expansion of Norse seafaring range had reached another point of contact between water and solid ground. The navigator stands forward of the mast, his body still, his gaze fixed upon the horizon, where the sky meets the water, in a line so fine, it seems drawn by a blade. His prolonged study of the horizon, seeking confirmation, has lasted since the first pallining of the sky, and you watch him without watching, your own eyes drawn repeatedly to that vacancy, that promise, that space where something might resolve from nothing. The Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic represented not accident, but intention, voyage after voyage building upon the knowledge of the last, and this man carries in his memory the accumulated reckonings of those who had sailed before, the angles of sun and star, the feel of current and wind, the duration of thirst and uncertainty. Iceland's vegetation, maintained by the Gulf Stream, would appear green and promising to arrivals from harsher Norwegian coasts, but first it must be found. First, it must emerge from the concealing curve of the world. The changed color of the water near shore, lighter, full of suspended sediment, reaches the hull before any eye confirms what the water already knows. You see it in the passing of the oar blades, in the luminescence that gathers where the surface is disturbed, a milkiness, a promise of substance beneath the surface, of rivers entering, of soil held in suspension, of the land's slow exhalation into its surrounding sea. The sound of surf breaking on a beach, different from open sea swell, begins as a murmur below the threshold of certainty, a texture added to the wind's constant voice, a rhythm that speaks of resistance, of energy spent against something that does not yield, that does not move with the pressure upon it. The settlement period is traditionally dated from 874, the year of Ingolfur Arnarsson's arrival, and somewhere in the succession of voyages that followed, this moment repeats, this approach, this gathering of signs, this slow conviction that the void is ending, that the horizontal world will soon acquire verticality, depth, the detail of the actual. The first definite sighting comes not as revelation, but as persistence, a line of darkness above the sea's curve that holds against the shifting of your gaze, that returns when you look again after the doubt, after the turning away. It sits low, so low, a fraction darker than the clouds above it, a fraction lighter than the water below, and you do not speak of it because speech would require certainty, would require the commitment of the word to what the eye still questions. The Norse name island may reflect deliberate discouragement of further settlers or observation of ice in fjords, but those who named it were still to come, still to walk the meadows and make their choices of description. And for now, there is only this dark line, this first geometry of arrival. The Gulf Stream carries its warmth northward, maintaining what the Norse colonists from western Norway would find, beginning in the 870, a landscape greener than their expectations, greener than the harsher coasts they had left behind, and perhaps this greenness begins in the darkness itself, in the quality of the shadow that resolves now into the suggestion of height, of mass, of land. The gradual resolution of the shoreline into cliffs, then slopes, then the detail of green occupies the long morning, the sun climbing to its modest height as the distance diminishes by aching fractions. You see the white where waves meet rock, the spray rising and falling in a rhythm older than the voyage, older than the intention that brought these particular hulls to this particular meeting. The cliffs define themselves first as sheer darkness, then as texture, then as the particular geometry of basalt columns, of scree slopes, of the layered history of volcanic construction and oceanic erosion. The slopes descend to lower ground, to the possibility of approach, of landing, of the transition from one element to another that the voyage has made necessary and strange. The visual green of Iceland's coastal meadows, intensified by northern light, remains still a promise, still a color imagined more than perceived, but the darkness of the cliffs carries within it the suggestion of what lies above, what lies behind, the interior that awaits the step from shingle onto turf, from the unstable to the rooted. The seabirds wheel in greater numbers now, their cries sharp against the broader voices of wind and water, their flight paths describing the contours of the shore they know with the intimacy of repetition, of generation upon generation nesting in the same crevices, fishing the same currents. The ship's turn to run parallel, seeking a place to beach and land, comes at the navigator's word, at the accumulated judgment of eyes and memory, the hull responding to the steering oar with a sluggishness born of fatigue, of the water's changed character, of the proximity of bottom to surface. The oars rise and fall in altered rhythm, no longer the deep pull of open water, but shorter strokes, more frequent, the crew matching their effort to the new demands of shallowing sea. The Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic represented a systematic expansion of Norse seafaring range, and each landing, each successful approach, each place found and named and remembered, built upon the last, refined the knowledge, extended the possible. The smell strengthens as the distance narrows, the particular absence of salt dominance giving way to the positive presence of vegetative decay, of pollen, of the mineral exhalation of fresh water entering salt, the complex chemistry of boundary, of meeting, of transition. The place is chosen not for beauty, but for practicality, for the angle of approach, the depth of water, the slope of beach, the protection from the prevailing wind that has carried you across the unknown distance. The ship's head turns toward the shore, the oars backing water to control the speed of approach, the hull trembling with the changed resistance, the changed support, the nearness of what does not move with the sea. The final grounding on shingle comes as shock, as sudden stasis after days of constant motion, the keel meeting the yielding stones with a sound felt through the feet more than heard, the surge of the last wave lifting the stern and releasing it, lifting and releasing, the rhythm of arrival, of ending, of the voyage's completion in this particular place at this particular hour. The leap to shore follows not as triumph, but as necessity, the body moving from the unstable platform to the unstable ground, the shingle moving underfoot after days of wooden deck, each step sinking and shifting and finding temporary purchase before the next displacement. The psychological effect of solid ground after days at sea includes persistent sensation of motion, the body continuing to compensate for a movement that no longer occurs, the eyes seeking horizon to confirm stability, finding instead the immediacy of slope and stone and the green that rises above the beach in the first true meadow, the first true ground that does not end in water. You stand upon the shingle and feel the land's strange stillness, its refusal to respond to your weight with the give and recovery of the deck, its absolute presence, its indifference to your arrival. Landfall after prolonged voyage brought relief of tension and immediate practical demands, the body passing from the suspended waiting of the open water to the urgent necessities of securing what had carried you, of finding what would sustain you, of establishing the first primitive order upon the chaos of arrival. Beaching and securing the ship was the first priority, the crew moving with the automatism of practiced procedure, The ropes carried to boulders, to driftwood, to any fixed point that would hold against the tide's return, against the wind's shift, against the possibility that the place of landing might yet reject them, might yet return them to the water that had brought them. Fresh water and reconnaissance followed, the small party moving up the slope of shingle to the turf beyond, to the stream that could be heard before it was seen, the sound of fresh water running unopposed to the sea, a sound different in its continuousness from the waves' rhythmic crash and retreat. The taste of it, cupped in palms still salt-scaled, carried the sweetness of arrival, the chemical confirmation that this land maintained the cycle of rain and river and spring, that the Gulf Stream's warmth translated not only into the visual green of Iceland's coastal meadows, but into the fundamental possibility of survival, of duration, of the life that requires land and water in proportions different from the sea's overwhelming dominance. The reconnaissance extended outward from the landing place, the first steps tentative upon the strange stability, the body still expecting the deck's motion, still compensating for a rhythm that persisted only in memory, in the phantom sensation of rise and fall, that would diminish across hours and days, but never wholly depart. The Norse colonists from western Norway, beginning in the 870s, carried with them the knowledge of harsher coasts, of shorter growing seasons, of the struggle for sustenance that had driven or drawn them across the water to this new possibility. Iceland's vegetation, maintained by the Gulf Stream, appeared green and promising to these arrivals, the meadows broader than memory, the summer's length deceptive in the long light, the promise of sufficiency written in the lushness that extended inland from the coastal strip. Greenland was named by Eric the Red in what later saga tradition describes as a deliberate act of promotional naming, a strategy that some scholars have contrasted with the possible discouragement embedded in Ireland, reflecting the belief that names could shape perceptions of a place. The Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic represented this systematic expansion, not only of Norse seafaring range, but of the naming that made expansion meaningful, that transformed the unknown into the known, the water-crossed into the reachable, the potential into the actual. Successful voyages established routes that were repeated and refined across generations, the knowledge of winds and currents, and the signs of approach passing from navigator to navigator, from crew to crew, the oral map growing more detailed, more reliable, more capable of supporting the intention to cross again, to carry others, to make the voyage routine rather than exceptional. The return voyage, if undertaken, faced different wind patterns and required adjusted navigation, the familiarity of the outward path not translating directly into the homeward, the asymmetry of the Atlantic's circulation demanding its own learning, its own accumulation of successful and failed attempts. Many settlers did not return, their ships becoming permanent parts of new communities, the hulls drawn up above the tide line, broken up for materials, incorporated into the structures of dwelling and storage, and the gradual transformation of temporary landing into permanent habitation. The shingle moves underfoot as you walk the beach, each step a small negotiation of balance and weight, the body learning again the grammar of land, after the simplified syntax of the deck's limited motion. The smell of land before it is seen has given way to the fuller presence of land experienced, the vegetation not merely suggested but encountered, the earth not merely anticipated but trodden, the particular absence of salt dominance now replaced by the complex positive presence of soil and growth, and the slow decomposition that feeds renewal. The ship rests upon the shingle, the crew moving about it with the diminished urgency of those who have arrived, who have fulfilled the immediate necessity, who face now the longer rhythm of establishing presence, of building the first fire, of raising the first temporary shelter, of beginning the transformation of voyage into life. The seabirds that announce the approach continue their wheeling, their cries now part of the place rather than signal of its nearness, their presence incorporated into the new normal of this shore, this landing, this beginning. The persistent sensation of motion continues as you stand upon the shingle, as you climb the low slope to the meadow's edge, as you feel the turf give slightly beneath your weight, the roots hold upon the soil yielding just enough to remind you of the deck's response, of the constant, small adjustments that prolonged voyage had made automatic. The body remembers what the mind has already released, the compensation for movement becoming itself, a kind of movement, a ghost rhythm that haunts the stillness, that makes the solid ground seem strangely unstable, strangely demanding of attention that the deck's honest motion had not required. The immediate practical demands continue, the reconnaissance extending further from the landing place, the search for fresh water leading inland along the stream's course, the discovery of its source in the spring that breaks from the hillside, clear and cold, and tasting of the rock through which it has passed. The Gulf Stream's warmth likely contributed to the relatively mild conditions that Norse colonists encountered beginning in the 870, supporting the greenness and habitability that distinguished the region from surrounding areas. The Scandinavian settlement of the North Atlantic represented the systematic expansion of Norse seafaring range into regions where such springs existed, where such meadows could be found, where the conditions of life might be established with sufficient labor and sufficient luck, sufficient persistence across the years of difficulty that followed the first deceptive promise of arrival. The ship's timbers dry upon the shingle, the tide receding from the hull's lower planks, the vessel becoming now a feature of the shore, a sign of human presence, a promise of return, or a monument to arrival depending upon what follows, upon the seasons turning, upon the decisions that will be made in the days and weeks of first establishment. You stand in this light, upon this ground, the shingle left behind, the meadow's edge becoming the place where you are, where the voyage deposits you, where the next phase begins without clear boundary or announcement, simply continuing from what has been into what will be. The smell of land before it is seen has become the smell of land as it is lived, the vegetation not merely detected at distance, but encountered in detail, the particular species, the particular stage of growth, the particular decomposition and renewal that constitutes the life of this place, this Iceland, this island, this green shore upon the horizon that was first darkness, then line, then cliff and slope, and the detail that the eye could finally receive. The shingle moves underfoot as you return to the ship, the day's reconnaissance complete, the first knowledge gathered, the first impressions fixed in memory against the fading that time will bring, the transformation of immediate experience into the stored resource upon which future action will draw. The crew gathers about the hull, the tasks of securing completed, the fire begun upon the upper beach, the smoke rising thin against the sky's pale expanse. The systematic expansion of Norse seafaring range across the North Atlantic brought bodies to this shore, brought intention and need and the willingness to endure, and the shore received them, held them, became the ground upon which endurance could be practiced, upon which the temporary could become, across generations, the established, the named, the known. The darkness that held you at the chapter's beginning, horizontal, warm, carried by the rhythm of blood and breathing, finds its parallel in the darkness that will follow this day of arrival, the first night upon the new land, the first sleep upon ground that does not move, that holds, that asks nothing but presence, persistence, the continuation of consciousness into the next day and the next, the building of life upon the foundation of arrival. The Norse colonists from western Norway, beginning in the late 9th century, would likely have known this darkness, this first night, this transition from the voyage suspended time to the land's more substantial duration.